Welcome back to Terrified Tales, where the rain falls slow and the fear creeps in quicker. Like and subscribe before we begin, and tell us where and when you're listening. Midnight, alone, that's when they find you. Ivy Barrett stepped off the train and onto the cracked asphalt of Oak Ridge's small station, her suitcase in hand and a new chapter of her life beginning to unfold. The cold wind whipped her hair around her face, and she pulled the collar of her jacket tighter against the chill. The town before her looked like something out of a forgotten postcard, quaint, charming, and far too quiet. Oak Ridge was nothing like the bustling city she'd left behind, but that was precisely why she was here. She needed silence. She needed to start over, away from the noise of her old life. The sudden and messy breakup had left her feeling empty, her purpose torn away like pages from a diary. Her friends had urged her to stay, to work things out, but Ivy knew the only way forward was to leave. And Oak Ridge, a small town she'd read about in an old travel magazine, seemed like the perfect place to disappear. The train had left her with more than just the physical distance from the life she'd known. It had left her with a gnawing emptiness. She felt like a stranger even in the solitude of her own thoughts. The station was empty, save for an elderly woman sitting on a bench, knitting something Ivy couldn't quite make out. The woman's eyes were downcast, her movements slow and deliberate, but there was something about her that made Ivy feel as though she was being watched. Ivy shook the feeling off and made her way toward the edge of the station. The town stretched out before her, a series of weathered cottages, their roofs dusted with early autumn leaves. In the distance, she could see the glint of water, the lake. It was the thing that had piqued her interest when she first read about Oak Ridge. The locals spoke of the lake as if it were a living thing, a presence that shaped the town's history and its people. Her eyes lingered on it for a moment, the dark water catching the low light of the late afternoon. But she wasn't here for folklore or gossip. Ivy was a journalist, not a believer in ghost stories or supernatural curses. She was here to write, to recover, and maybe, just maybe, to find some new direction for her career. She had a few freelance assignments lined up, but that was all. She had no intention of staying forever. A creak from behind her made her turn. An old man with a white beard and a hunched back was approaching her, his gait slow and deliberate. His eyes were piercingly bright against his wrinkled face, and when he smiled, it felt more like a warning than a greeting. "You must be Ivy Barrett," he said in a raspy voice. His accent was faint, almost unnoticeable. "I'm Mr. Harrow. Welcome to Oak Ridge." Ivy gave a polite nod, unsure of what to say. She'd heard of Mr. Harrow. He was the town historian. People in Oak Ridge seemed to speak of him as though he were a living relic of the past. But she had no desire to delve into small-town histories. Not now. She was here to start fresh, not get tangled in someone else's folklore. "I trust you'll find things to your liking here," Mr. Harrow continued, his eyes scanning the horizon as if he were waiting for something. "But I must warn you, there are things about this town that we don't speak of lightly. The lake in particular, best to avoid it when the water turns." Ivy's brow furrowed in confusion. She had heard rumors, of course. Oak Ridge's residents had a certain way of speaking in riddles. "The lake? What do you mean?" Mr. Harrow's smile didn't fade, but there was an edge to it now. "It has a way of pulling people in, Miss Barrett. I'd hate to see you get too close. The water's darker than you think, and it's better to leave such things alone." Ivy didn't respond immediately. His warning didn't surprise her. Small towns always had their superstitions. "I'm here for work," she said finally, her voice steady. "Not for legends." Mr. Harrow gave a curt nod, his eyes still on the distant water. "I hope you keep it that way." He turned to leave, but then paused. "If you need anything, Miss Barrett, don't hesitate to ask. But remember, some things are better left undisturbed." With that, he shuffled away, leaving Ivy to absorb his words. She stood there for a moment, staring at his retreating figure. She wasn't sure what he meant, but she didn't have the energy to worry about it. The last few months had been exhausting, and she had too much on her plate already. The lake, the town's history, those were things she'd deal with later. As she watched Mr. Harrow disappear down the road, Ivy felt a shift in the air, as though Oakridge itself was holding its breath. She shook the thought from her mind and turned toward the inn where she'd be staying, ready to settle in and forget the strange encounter. But in the back of her mind, something about the lake's presence lingered, as if it were waiting. And Ivy couldn't quite shake the feeling that her arrival in Oakridge was no coincidence. The sun was low on the horizon the next day, when Ivy ventured out of her room and into the heart of Oakridge. The town was picturesque, its cobblestone streets lined with aged brick buildings, ivy creeping up their walls, and small shops tucked between houses that looked as if they'd been pulled from the pages of a forgotten storybook. There was a tranquility here, a kind of quiet that Ivy hadn't realized she'd been craving. The hum of city life, endless noise, the frantic energy of the outside world, was nothing but a memory now. Oakridge was a place of respite, and for the first time in months, Ivy felt a strange calm settle over her. Her feet carried her down Main Street, past a quaint bakery that filled the air with the warm scent of freshly baked bread, and a bookstore, its window cluttered with old leather-bound volumes. Despite the beauty of the place, there was something that felt a bit off, like a lingering shadow that hovered just beneath the surface, never quite revealed. It wasn't just the silence, which Ivy had expected. It was something more, a heaviness in the air, as if the land itself was watching, waiting. She turned the corner and came face to face with the town's central landmark, the small stone chapel that stood on the hill just beyond the lake. The chapel's spire reached high into the sky, and its bells rang faintly, calling out to the town below. There, nestled behind the chapel, Ivy could see the vast expanse of the lake stretching out like a darkened mirror. Her pulse quickened. The lake was beautiful, but there was something undeniably unsettling about its stillness. It looked as if it had never moved, its surface like glass, reflecting the pale blue of the sky and the grey of the surrounding mountains. Ivy had heard about the lake from the townspeople already, their hushed tones and hesitant glances when it came up in conversation, the way they all seemed to regard it with a mixture of reverence and fear. Everyone in Oakridge seemed to know about its power. Even the very mention of the lake's name felt like an invocation of something dark and ancient. People claimed it was cursed, an old myth that had been passed down through generations. But Ivy, as a journalist, wasn't one for idle gossip. She needed facts, not folklore. Determined to get to the bottom of this strange town mystery, Ivy decided it was time to visit Malcolm Pierce, the town historian, whose warning the day before had piqued her curiosity. He was the one person in Oakridge who seemed to know more about the lake's story. If there was anyone who could shed light on its dark history, it would be him. The town library was an old building, tucked behind a row of houses and framed by a grove of tall oaks. The sign above the door read Oakridge Public Library, but it looked like something out of a bygone era, its stone walls cracked with age, the wooden door worn from use. Ivy pushed the door open, the bell above it ringing faintly, and stepped inside. The cool, musty air greeted her, and the faint smell of old paper and dust filled her senses. The library was dimly lit, its rows of shelves stretching out in every direction, filled with countless volumes that had likely never been touched by anyone in years. Most of the town's history was contained in these old books, pages yellowed and brittle with time. There was no sound except for the faint rustling of the wind outside and the soft tapping of a distant clock ticking away. Behind the counter sat Felicity Reeve, the librarian, her head bent over an open book. She was a quiet woman, probably in her early 30s, with dark hair that hung loosely around her shoulders. Her eyes flicked up as Ivy approached, offering her a soft, almost wary smile. "You're new here, aren't you?" Felicity asked, her voice quiet, as though speaking louder might disturb something invisible in the air. Ivy nodded. "Yes, just moved in. I'm Ivy Barrett. I'm actually looking for some information about the lake." Felicity's expression shifted slightly, her lips pressed together, her eyes flicking toward the windows as if ensuring no one else was nearby. "The lake," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. That's a strange request. What do you want to know?" Ivy leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "I've been hearing strange things about it, how it turns black every decade and people disappear. Some of the townsfolk are hesitant to talk about it, but I need to know more. I'm a journalist." Felicity glanced around again, as though checking for eavesdroppers, before finally nodding and standing up. She moved quickly, almost too quickly, to a section of the library at the far back. Ivy followed, her curiosity piqued. "You'll want to look at these," Felicity said, pulling out a set of leather-bound books that looked incredibly old. Their spines were cracked, and the pages inside were filled with handwritten notes and dates. "What are these?" Ivy asked, running her fingers over the surface of one of the books. The weight of it seemed heavier than it should have been, as though it held more than just history. "These are the original town records," Felicity explained. "Everything you want to know about Oak Ridge and its history with the lake is in here, but I should warn you," she hesitated, a slight tremor in her voice, "not everyone wants you to dig too deep. The lakes, it's not something people talk about." Ivy furrowed her brow but took the book, flipping it open carefully. As she scanned the pages, she found notes from the early settlers, accounts of strange occurrences, unexplained disappearances, and a series of cryptic references to the lake's dark power. It seemed the lake had always been a fixture in Oak Ridge's history, but what truly caught Ivy's attention were the repeated mentions of something darker, a pact made by the town's founders. The language was vague, the entries cryptic, but it was clear that the town's prosperity was tied to something buried beneath the lake's surface, something the early settlers had apparently promised to. Ivy's fingers trembled as she turned the pages. In one particularly aged entry, she found an old journal excerpt written by someone named Samuel Reeve, the ancestor of Felicity, it seemed. It spoke of a ritual performed to ensure the town's survival, a ritual that involved offerings to an entity beneath the lake. Ivy's eyes skimmed the words, her pulse quickening. The offerings had been made to ensure the town's wealth and safety, but there was a chilling warning attached to them. Every decade, the lake demanded another offering. It wasn't enough to just give, however. No, the settlers had been warned that should they fail to fulfill the demands, the curse would return, worse than before. Ivy felt a chill run down her spine. The book in her hands seemed heavier now, its pages filled with a sense of foreboding. She had no doubt this was the story Malcolm had alluded to the day before, the town's darkest secret. But what troubled Ivy the most was the fact that the ritual, whatever it was, had never truly been broken, not in all these years. As she closed the book, Ivy glanced over at Felicity, who was now watching her intently, her gaze heavy with something unspoken. "There's more, isn't there?" Ivy asked softly. "About the woman, Isabella, was it? The one who died in the lake?" Felicity's face paled, and she lowered her eyes, almost as if the mention of the name had physically pained her. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," she said quietly. "Isabella Hartfield. She was the last sacrifice made to the lake. Her death, it triggered something in the water, something ancient. That was when the curse truly began." Ivy felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She wanted to ask more, but something in Felicity's voice stopped her. The librarian had already said more than she had probably intended to. Ivy could sense the weight of the town's silence pressing in on her, but she couldn't back down. Now, the mystery of the lake and its hold on Oak Ridge was only deepening. "I need to know everything," Ivy said, her voice firm now, despite the unease creeping into her chest. "I need to understand why this is happening, and why no one is doing anything about it." Felicity's eyes met hers, and Ivy saw a flash of something, regret, fear, or perhaps both, pass through them. "You're asking the wrong questions," she murmured, "and you're asking them at the wrong time." Before Ivy could respond, Felicity turned and walked quickly back to the counter, as though there was something she wanted to put between herself and Ivy. A thick silence hung between them. Ivy stood still for a moment, feeling the weight of the secrets that Oak Ridge held pressing against her. The lake was more than just a body of water. It was a living thing, a force that had shaped the town and its people for centuries, and she was only just beginning to unravel the truth. But what would happen when she did? Would she be able to stop it, or had she already stepped into a trap that no one could escape? That night, as Ivy lay in bed, the soft rustle of wind against the trees outside her window seemed like the only sound in the entire world. The inn was quiet, its creaky wooden floors settling under the weight of a day's silence. The only light in the room was the soft glow of the moon slipping through the cracks in the curtains, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor like dark fingers. Ivy had tried to distract herself with the history of Oak Ridge, poring over the books Felicity had given her, but her mind kept returning to the lake. It had a pull, something she couldn't quite explain, a heaviness that weighed on her chest every time she thought about it. The town's history, its superstitions, and the mysterious woman Isabella who had died there, these threads all seemed to lead back to that single dark water. And then there were the dreams. She had tried to dismiss them, to chalk them up to stress or the remnants of a long journey. But no matter how much she tried to focus on the small details of her research, the dreams kept coming, stronger and more vivid each time. She had woken up in a cold sweat the night before, heart pounding in her chest, the images still burned into her mind like they were painted on the insides of her eyelids. Ivy rolled over and pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching her. She had to admit, there was a growing sense of dread in her chest, something darker than the lake's shadow. It wasn't just the town's history or the stories of disappearances. It was something far more visceral, more immediate. The dream she'd had last night still haunted her. In the dream, she stood at the edge of the lake, her feet sinking slightly into the wet sand. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of damp earth, and the fog hung low over the water, swirling around. Her ankles like cold fingers, the lake stretched out before her, vast and endless, its surface as still as a mirror. The water was darker than it should have been, like ink, black and impossible to see through. A sound cut through the silence. A faint whisper, a voice on the wind, too soft to understand, but unmistakably there. Ivy strained to listen, the voice growing louder, as if calling her name. "Ivy!" The whisper was a soft caress against her ear, a voice that sounded both familiar and foreign. She turned around, searching for the source, but the mist obscured everything beyond a few feet in any direction. The fog shifted, swirling more intensely, and from the depths of it, a figure emerged. At first, it was nothing more than a silhouette. Tall, slim, draped in something dark that clung to her body like a shroud. The woman's face was pale, her features obscured by the mist, but Ivy felt a strange pull toward her, an inexplicable connection that made her step forward. The woman's eyes locked onto Ivy's, and for a brief moment, everything else faded away. The fog, the lake, the cold air, all of it was drowned out by the intensity of those eyes. They were wide, dark and full of pain. They seemed to reach out to Ivy, begging for something Ivy could not understand. "Help me," the woman whispered. Her voice barely audible but filled with desperate urgency. Ivy's heart skipped a beat. "Who are you?" she asked, though her voice was barely more than a croak in the thick air. The woman didn't answer. Instead, her hands reached out toward Ivy, as though she were trying to pull her into the depths of the lake. Ivy instinctively took a step back, but something in her chest tightened, an unspoken force drawing her closer. "Please." The woman's voice was louder now, more insistent. "It's your turn." The words froze Ivy in place. She felt a cold chill running through her body, the sensation of being trapped, of being swallowed by something far older and more powerful than she could comprehend. The woman stepped closer, and Ivy could see her clearly now. Her skin was ghostly white, her lips parted in a silent scream. Her clothes were tattered, her long hair dark and matted, as though it had been soaked and dragged through the lake for years. "Help me," the woman repeated, her voice growing more desperate. "Free me!" But Ivy didn't have time to respond. The woman lunged, her hands reaching for Ivy's throat with a force that felt unnatural. Ivy gasped as she felt the cold fingers wrap around her neck, squeezing, choking the air out of her. She struggled, trying to pull away, but her body wouldn't respond. The more she fought, the tighter the grip became, until her vision started to blur. Suddenly, Ivy was pulled out of the dream. She gasped for air, her body jerking upright in bed as though she'd been yanked from the water's depths. Her heart pounded in her chest, her hands shaking. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon, still high in the sky. She felt the sweat dripping down her back, her breathing ragged, as if she'd been running for her life. For a long moment, Ivy sat there, trying to steady her breath, trying to shake off the lingering fear that still clung to her like a second skin. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, still feeling the remnants of the woman's touch on her throat, the sensation of being dragged under. It had felt so real, too real. She had never been one to believe in supernatural forces, but there was something about that dream. The woman's eyes, the cold touch, that made her question everything she had assumed about the town and its strange, oppressive history. There was no mistaking it now. The lake was connected to something far darker than she had imagined. She climbed out of bed and made her way to the window, pulling aside the curtain slightly to peer out into the night. The lake stretched out before her, the black water reflecting the pale light of the moon, its surface as still and unyielding as it had been the day before. It looked almost alive. The faintest ripple stirred in the middle, but Ivy couldn't be sure if it was just the wind or something else. It was then that she heard it again. The whisper, soft, faint, like a voice on the edge of hearing. Ivy. Her breath hitched. The voice. It was the same one from the dream. She felt her pulse quicken, the room suddenly closing in around her. She turned away from the window and closed her eyes, trying to calm herself. This was just a dream, just a manifestation of her growing anxiety, she told herself. There was no way the woman in the dream was real, no way the lake was calling to her. But deep down, Ivy knew something had changed. She couldn't shake the feeling that the lake was pulling at her, that the boundaries between reality and dream were blurring in ways she hadn't expected. The more she resisted, the stronger the pull seemed to become. "I have to find out what this is," Ivy muttered to herself. The curse of Oak Ridge, the strange deaths and disappearances, the whispers, the pull of the lake, all of it had to be connected to something much deeper. She had felt it in her bones, in the pit of her stomach. It wasn't just about the town's history or its legends anymore. It was about her, about what the lake wanted from her, and why. Ivy didn't know what she was going to do next, but she had to find answers. The town's strange silence, its unwillingness to speak of the past, was suffocating. It was as if they all knew something she didn't, a secret they were keeping for their own safety. And Ivy was determined to uncover it. The following morning, Ivy walked to the edge of Oakridge's town square, the chill of the early autumn air biting at her skin. Her breath came out in soft puffs of mist as she wrapped her coat tighter around her body, eyes scanning the horizon. A grey fog had rolled in overnight, clinging to the buildings and creeping through the streets like something alive. There was a sense of quiet intensity in the air today, something Ivy couldn't quite explain. It felt as though the town was bracing itself for something, though she couldn't yet pinpoint exactly what. Despite her lingering unease, Ivy's resolve was stronger than ever. The night before had shaken her, there was no denying that, but it had also propelled her forward. The dream, the haunting voice, the woman's desperate plea. It all pointed back to the lake, and she needed to understand why. Every instinct told her that the answers were buried in the dark waters, and she wasn't about to back down now. She had planned to visit the local archives again, to dig deeper into the history of the town and the lake. But today, something felt different. The closer she got to the lake, the more the town seemed to change. There was an oppressive energy in the air, a weight that pressed on her chest, as if the very land around her was shifting in preparation for what was to come. The sky hung low, the clouds a sickly shade of grey, and the trees along the shore seemed to bend and twist as if they were trying to escape the pull of the water. As she neared the lake, Ivy found herself slowing her pace, a strange reluctance taking hold of her. The once placid expanse of water seemed darker now, its surface roiling as if stirred by some unseen force. She could hear the faint lapping of the water against the shore, but it sounded distant, almost as if it were coming from far beneath the earth rather than from the lake itself. Her feet moved of their own accord, carrying her closer to the shore. The further she walked, the more the air around her seemed to grow colder. The wind had picked up, swirling around her and carrying with it the damp scent of the lake. It was a smell that seemed to claw at the back of her mind, dredging up memories of things long forgotten, of dreams and whispers that echoed through the night. She reached the shore and stood there for a moment, gazing out at the lake's surface. The water, once a reflective mirror, was now a void, a deep, inky black that seemed to swallow all light. The lake was no longer a place of quiet beauty. It was something darker, something alive, a presence that hung over the town like a shadow, waiting for the moment when it would reclaim what it had been promised. Ivy was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't hear the footsteps behind her at first. She turned quickly, startled, only to find Dylan standing there, watching her, with an unreadable expression. His fishing rod was slung over his shoulder, his usual quiet demeanor more intense today, as if the very air around him had shifted. "You shouldn't be here," Dylan said, his voice low but firm. Ivy frowned, her heart beating faster. "I don't understand. What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling despite herself. "Why is the lake like this? It's never looked like this before." Dylan took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he looked out at the water. "You're feeling it too, then?" he muttered, more to himself than to Ivy. He paused before meeting her gaze again, his jaw tightening. "This is the first sign. The lake's starting to change. It's blackening." Ivy's breath caught in her throat. She had heard the townsfolk speak of the lake's blackening, but no one had ever explained what it meant exactly. She had assumed it was just an old superstition, another piece of folklore wrapped in mystery. But now, standing here at the edge of the lake with Dylan, she could feel the truth of it pressing against her. There was no denying it. Something was happening, something beyond her understanding. "I thought the lake's blackening happened every decade." "Why now? Why is it happening so soon?" Ivy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is it about this year?" Dylan looked away, his expression haunted. "It's not just the blackening," he said quietly. "It's more than that. The lake, it calls, Ivy. It's been calling for years. And when it calls, it takes. Always." Ivy felt a chill crawl up her spine as she stared at him. Takes? Takes what? She could barely hear the words as they left her mouth, the horror of the implications settling over her like a heavy fog. "People," Dylan said simply. "It takes people, and it doesn't let go." The sound of his words sent a shiver through Ivy's body, but before she could respond, a low, distant rumble echoed from the depths of the lake. It was subtle at first, just a faint vibration in the air, but it grew louder, rising from beneath the surface like the growl of some unseen beast stirring from its slumber. Ivy felt it deep in her bones, a vibration that seemed to shake the very earth beneath her feet. The water rippled, its inky black surface breaking apart in small waves, but there was no wind, no natural force that could explain the disturbance. Dylan stepped back, his face pale, his eyes wide with a fear that Ivy had never seen in him before. He glanced nervously over his shoulder, as though expecting something to emerge from the lake at any moment. "Ivy, you need to go back," he urged, his voice tight with urgency. "The lake's not just a body of water, it's alive. And when it's ready, it takes. It's taken my father, and it will take anyone who gets too close. It's not just a curse, it's a force, a hunger." Ivy shook her head, her mind spinning with the implications of his words. The blackening, the lake's power, the disappearances. It all seemed to be connected, tied together by some dark force that neither science nor reason could explain. "I don't understand," Ivy said, her voice cracking. "What does it want? Why does it take people?" Dylan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took another step back, his eyes locked on the lake as though he expected something to rise from the depths. "It's not just about the water," Dylan muttered, his voice low and strained. "The lake's connected to everything, the town, the land, the people. It feeds on what we bury, what we refuse to face. Every decade it calls, and this time, I think it's calling for someone else." Ivy felt her heart race. "Who?" Dylan met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and regret. "It's calling for you, Ivy." The words hit Ivy like a physical blow. She took a step back, her pulse hammering in her ears. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "It can't be. I'm just here for work. I don't even belong here." Dylan's face was grim. "Doesn't matter. The lake doesn't care who you are. It takes what it's owed, and this time, you've been marked." Before Ivy could respond, the rumbling from the lake grew louder, more insistent, like the sound of something shifting beneath the water, something massive and ancient. The surface of the lake broke apart in violent ripples, and Ivy could swear she saw something moving just beneath the surface, something enormous, something dark. Her breath caught in her throat and she took a step back, her heart pounding. And then, as if in response to the lake's growing fury, the fog rolled in thicker, blanketing everything in a heavy, oppressive silence. The sound of the water, the rumbling beneath, and the whispers of the wind all seemed to fade into one, until Ivy felt as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Dylan turned sharply and began to walk away, his pace quickening. "You need to leave, Ivy," he called over his shoulder, his voice strained, "before it's too late." But Ivy couldn't move. The pull of the lake, the weight of the town's dark history, and the certainty that something had already begun to stir deep within the water. It was all too much. Her body felt frozen in place, as though the lake had already claimed her, even if only in spirit. "I can't leave," Ivy whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the rushing wind. "I have to understand." And with that, she took one last step toward the edge of the lake. The days following Ivy's visit to the lake felt like a blur, each one blending into the next in a haze of confusion, unease, and growing fear. The blackening of the water had begun, and with it, a tangible shift in the atmosphere of Oakridge. The town, once quiet and seemingly peaceful, now felt like a place suspended between worlds, caught in a kind of limbo between the natural and the supernatural. Every step Ivy took, she felt the weight of it pressing on her, as though the very air she breathed was thick with something ancient and unknowable. The lake was the focal point, a dark, looming presence at the edge of the town that seemed to call to her, pulling her closer each day. But it wasn't just the lake that haunted Ivy. It was the dreams. They had begun the night of her encounter with Dylan at the shore, and since then, they had only grown more vivid, more intense, more real. Every time she closed her eyes, she could feel herself drawn back to that same place, the edge of the lake, the fog, and the figure in the water, the woman, Isabella. Each dream began the same way. Ivy would stand at the shore, the black water stretching out before her like an abyss, the fog swirling around her ankles. She could hear the whispers on the wind, soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent. She would turn, and there she would be, Isabella, standing at the edge of the water, her pale face twisted in a silent scream, her eyes wide and pleading. "Help me!" Isabella's voice would float through the fog, echoing in Ivy's ears like a distant memory. "Please, free me." The words would sink into Ivy's mind like a seed, planting themselves deep in her consciousness, until she could no longer tell where the dream ended and reality began. She would try to approach the woman, but each time she moved, Isabella would retreat, sinking deeper into the lake, her form becoming more distorted, more shadowed. The last time Ivy had reached out, the woman's hand had brushed hers, cold and lifeless, before pulling her under the surface. It wasn't just the dreams of Isabella that troubled Ivy. It was the feeling that came with them, the sensation that something was waiting for her beneath the water, something ancient and hungry, something that had been waiting for years, for centuries even. The lake, the land around it, the town of Oakridge itself. They were all bound together by something that was far beyond her understanding. And no matter how hard she tried to fight it, she couldn't shake the sense that she was meant to be a part of it, that she was being drawn in piece by piece like an offering to something that had claimed so many before her. Every night the dreams grew worse. She would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, the taste of the lake's dark water still lingering on her tongue. She would lie there in the darkness, her body rigid with fear, wondering if the lake's pull had already claimed her in some way, if she was already marked like so many before her. It was during one of these nights, after another nightmare, that left her shaking and breathless, that Ivy finally decided she couldn't wait any longer. She needed to confront the lake. She needed to understand why it was calling to her, why it was drawing her in, and what it wanted from her. The answers, she was certain, were buried in its depths. The moon was full the night she made her way to the shore again. The town had grown quiet, its streets empty, and the only sound was the faint rustling of the wind through the trees. Ivy wrapped herself in her coat, her breath visible in the crisp night air, and made her way down the winding path toward the lake. The further she walked, the heavier the silence seemed to become. It pressed on her chest, making it hard to breathe. And with every step, the water seemed to grow closer, as though it were reaching out to pull her in. She reached the edge of the lake, the fog rolling in thick and heavy around her feet. The moonlight bathed the water in an eerie glow, casting strange shadows on the surface. For a moment, Ivy just stood there staring at the stillness before her. The lake was vast, its surface untouched, as if nothing in the world had ever disturbed it. And yet she knew that something was lurking beneath it. The whispers started again, low at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. Ivy closed her eyes listening carefully, trying to focus on the sound. There was something familiar about it now, something almost comforting in the way the voices seemed to speak to her. Ivy. The whisper was unmistakable. It was Isabella's voice, echoing across the water, soft and haunting. Help me. The voice was clearer now, and Ivy felt the chill of it settle deep in her bones. She opened her eyes, and for the briefest moment, she thought she saw something moving beneath the surface, a shadow just beneath the water's skin. Her heart skipped a beat. The figure emerged slowly, at first a dark shape, then taking on more form. It was Isabella, her pale face twisted. With desperation, her eyes wide with a mixture of pain and fear, she reached out toward Ivy, her hands trembling, as if she were trying to grab hold of something just beyond her reach. "I've been waiting for you," Isabella whispered, her voice full of sorrow. "You're the one who can free me. You have to help me, Ivy." Ivy felt her breath catch in her throat. She wanted to step forward, to reach out and touch the woman, to try and help her in some way. But the closer she got, the more the water seemed to stir, the ripples spreading outward, and a growing darkness began to spread across the surface, engulfing everything in its path. "No," Ivy whispered, stepping back, her pulse racing. "I can't do this." The water grew darker, deeper, as if it were swallowing the moonlight, and the lake began to churn violently. The figure of Isabella twisted and writhed, her face contorted in pain as the water seemed to pull her under. The whispers grew louder, now not just Isabella's voice, but a chorus of voices, echoing from the depths, all crying out for release. "You're the one. You're the one who can stop it." The ground beneath Ivy's feet began to tremble, and she staggered back, her heart pounding in her chest. The lake was alive, pulling her in, and Ivy felt herself being drawn toward the water. Unable to stop herself, she could hear the woman's cries growing louder, could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on her. With a final scream, Isabella vanished beneath the surface, swallowed by the water, and the lake grew still once more, the whispers fading into the night. Ivy stood there, frozen, her body trembling with fear. She had seen it. She had seen the truth of it all. The lake was a force beyond comprehension, a dark, ancient power that had been waiting for her, for someone to finally come and answer its call. And now she knew she was a part of it. The curse had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many others. But she wasn't done yet. Ivy took a deep breath and forced herself to turn away from the water. She couldn't allow the lake to claim her completely. She would find a way to break the curse, to understand what had happened and why the town had been caught in its grip for so long. There was no turning back now. The days following Ivy's encounter at the lake felt surreal, as if the boundary between dream and reality had dissolved entirely. She couldn't shake the feeling that the lake's pull had already sunk into her very soul, that it was no longer just a place she visited, but something embedded within her, clawing at her from the inside. Her nights were filled with more dreams, more whispers, each one a constant reminder that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Ivy had tried to immerse herself in her work to keep her mind occupied, but the words on the pages of her assignments blurred together, and her thoughts kept drifting back to Oak Ridge. The town was changing too, its people growing more uneasy, their faces pale, their voices lowered whenever the lake was mentioned. Even the streets seemed quieter now, the once vibrant pulse of the town suppressed under an oppressive weight that everyone felt but no one could articulate. Every time Ivy closed her eyes, she saw Isabella, the woman from the lake, her eyes wide with desperation, her voice pleading for release. Ivy had been marked, she realized. The lake had chosen her, just as it had chosen so many others before her. The curse, the ancient power bound to the water, had reached out and drawn her in. But Ivy wasn't ready to accept her fate. She couldn't. No matter how deep the pull was, she would fight. She had to fight. There were too many unanswered questions, too many mysteries still left to unravel. The town's silence, its reluctance to speak of the lake's true nature, only fueled her resolve. She had to break the curse. She had to stop the lake from claiming anyone else. One evening, after a particularly unsettling night of nightmares, Ivy decided to visit the town's small church, an old stone building that sat on the hill overlooking the lake. The church had always seemed like a place of peace to her, a place where the weight of the world could be left behind, at least for a while. Perhaps, she thought, if she could find something, some answer, some piece of the puzzle, it would help her understand what she was up against. As she approached the church, the fog had rolled in again, thick and heavy, swirling around her feet. The air was damp, clinging to her skin like a layer of grime. The wind had picked up, making the branches of the trees groan and creak. It was as though the earth itself was responding to her presence, waiting for something to happen. Ivy felt the familiar tug of dread in her chest, but she ignored it. Pushing open the heavy wooden door and stepping inside, the interior of the church was dim, the only light coming from a few candles that flickered near the altar. The walls were adorned with faded paintings, their colors muted by age. The pews, though well worn, were empty, and the silence inside the church was almost suffocating, as though it had been waiting for her to arrive. The air felt thick with something she couldn't place, a presence that made her skin crawl. She walked toward the altar, her footsteps muffled by the worn stone floor. There, resting on a pedestal, was a small collection of ancient texts, books that looked as though they hadn't been touched in centuries. One in particular caught her eye, an old leather-bound tome, its cover cracked and frayed. The title was barely legible, but Ivy could make out a few words: "The waters beneath." Her pulse quickened. The book was almost certainly about the lake. Without hesitation, Ivy reached for it, her fingers brushing the cold leather. As she opened it, the pages crinkled, the scent of mildew and old paper filling the air. She began to scan the text, her heart racing as she read about the founding of Oak Ridge and the strange pact made by the early settlers. The book spoke of a ritual performed to ensure the prosperity of the town, a ritual that involved appeasing the spirit of the lake with sacrifices. But it didn't end there. The sacrifices weren't just about appeasing the lake, they were about sustaining it. Every decade, the town had to offer something to the water, something powerful enough to keep the curse at bay. The text was unclear, but Ivy understood the implication. The lake was not just a body of water. It was alive, it was hungry, and it had been fed for generations. The weight of what she was reading settled on her like a stone in her stomach. The lake wasn't just calling to the people of Oak Ridge, it had been manipulating them for centuries. Each sacrifice, each offering, had only served to strengthen its power, binding the town in an unbreakable grip. And now, it seemed, the time had come for the lake to collect. Ivy felt a wave of nausea rise in her chest. This was worse than she had imagined. The curse was not just about the lake's wrath, it was about the power it had over the town, over its people, and now it was turning toward her. She wasn't just a bystander, she was the next offering. She slammed the book shut, her breath coming in short gasps as the room around her seemed to close in. The silence felt oppressive, like the church itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Her heart pounded in her ears, and she realized with a sickening certainty that the lake was calling her. It wasn't just the dreams anymore. It was here, it was now, and it was demanding her attention. Ivy stumbled backward, her hand gripping the edge of the altar for support. She tried to steady herself, but her legs felt weak, as if they couldn't. "Hold her up." The whispers had returned louder this time, echoing in her mind, seeping into her thoughts like poison. "Ivy." She heard it again, the voice from the lake, The voice of Isabella, the voice of something ancient and dark. Come to me. The words wrapped around her like a suffocating rope, tightening with each passing second. Ivy's breath caught in her throat as she felt the pull, a force that seemed to draw her toward the lake, toward the water, toward whatever terrible thing awaited her there. She had to go, she had to face it. The truth was clear now. There was no escaping the lake. It had already claimed her, just as it had claimed so many before her. But Ivy wasn't ready to give in. She couldn't. With a final, shaky breath, Ivy forced herself to leave the church, the book still clutched tightly in her hand. She didn't know how much time she had left. She didn't know what the lake wanted from her, or why it had chosen her, but she knew one thing. She couldn't face it alone. She had to find someone who could help her understand the curse and how to stop it before it was too late. As Ivy stepped out into the foggy night, she heard the whispers again, louder this time, as if the lake itself was calling to her, beckoning her to come closer, to surrender. But she couldn't stop now. She wouldn't. She would fight it, no matter the cost. The fog clung to Ivy like a second skin as she made her way down the winding road, her heart pounding with the knowledge that the lake's pull was growing stronger by the hour. The whispers had never been this loud, nor this urgent. The cold air bit at her skin, and with each step she took she could feel the town's weight settling deeper on her chest, as if the very land beneath her feet was alive and aware of her every movement. She had to find the answers. She had to understand what was happening to her, to Oak Ridge, and why the lake was calling to her with such unrelenting force. Her hands trembled as she gripped the book tighter, the old leather tome still warm from her touch, its pages heavy with the secrets it held. The waters beneath had already given her a glimpse into the dark history of the lake, but there was more, so much more, that she needed to uncover. This was no ordinary curse. It wasn't just about the sacrifices, the blackening waters, or the strange disappearances. It was something far older, something woven into the very fabric of Oak Ridge itself. Ivy's destination was clear. She needed to visit the town's oldest residence, the Pierce estate. It was there that she hoped to find answers. She had already met Malcolm Pierce, the town historian, but something told her that the answers she needed weren't in the books or the archives. They were buried in the very blood of Oak Ridge's first families. The Pierces, like so many others in the town, had long since ceased to talk about the lake's curse, but Ivy could feel that they knew more than they were willing to share. As she walked through the streets, the town seemed quieter than usual, the air thick with anticipation. The only sound was the soft crunch of leaves under her boots. It was as though the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, something inevitable, something that had been a long time coming. The Pierce estate loomed ahead, an imposing structure perched on a hill overlooking the town. Ivy's eyes narrowed as she approached the iron gates that marked the boundary of the property. The house was large, old and imposing, with ivy creeping up its stone walls and windows that glinted in the moonlight like dark eyes watching her approach. It was a place that seemed to hold its secrets within, a fortress built on generations of history that Oak Ridge's residents preferred to leave undisturbed. Ivy stepped up to the gate, her heart racing. She hesitated for a moment before pressing the buzzer. The sound echoed through the quiet night, but there was no immediate response. Ivy's hand hovered over the button again, but before she could press it, the gate creaked open slowly on its own, as if inviting her in. She swallowed her unease and stepped inside. The estate's grounds were sprawling with overgrown hedges and gnarled trees that seemed to reach out like skeletal hands. The path leading to the house was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the pale glow of the moon. Ivy felt her breath catch in her throat as she walked toward the front door, the weight of the house pressing down on her. The wind had picked up again, making the trees groan and sway above her. When Ivy reached the front door, she knocked, the sound echoing through the empty space beyond. She waited for what felt like an eternity before the door finally opened, revealing Malcolm Pierce standing in the threshold, his face shadowed by the dim light. "Ivy Barrett," he said quietly, his voice tinged with a mixture of reluctance and concern. "What brings you here?" "I need to talk to you," Ivy replied, her voice steady despite the flutter of anxiety in her chest. "About the lake, about the history of this town. There's something I need to understand." Malcolm's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Ivy saw a flicker of something close to fear in his gaze. But he quickly masked it, his expression hardening into something more distant. "I've told you all I can," he said, stepping back to let her in. "There's nothing more to say." But Ivy wasn't about to let it go that easily. "There's more, isn't there? You know it. You know what the lake is and what it wants, and you know why it's calling me." Malcolm didn't respond immediately. Instead, he closed the door behind her, the sound of it locking echoing in the stillness of the house. He led her through the dimly lit hallways of the estate, the old wood creaking under their feet as they passed portraits of long-dead ancestors, their eyes watching from their gilded frames. Finally, they arrived in a small study at the back of the house, a room lined with more bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. The air in the room felt different, heavier, thicker, as if it had been sealed off from the rest of the world for years. Malcolm motioned for Ivy to sit, and though she hesitated, she did so. He sat down across from her, his hands resting on the desk in front of him. There was a long silence before he spoke again, his voice softer now, almost as though he were speaking to himself. "You're right," he said quietly. "There is more, but it's not something I wanted you to know. It's not something anyone should know." Ivy leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. "What do you mean?" Malcolm took a deep breath, his gaze shifting to the window where the wind howled outside. "The lake, it's not just a curse. It's an entity, an ancient power, older than the town itself. It's tied to the land, to the very heart of Oak Ridge. The settlers who founded this town made a deal with it, a pact to ensure their survival, to protect the town from disaster." Ivy felt a chill run down her spine. A pact? What kind of pact? Malcolm's eyes darkened as he looked back at her. They offered it blood. The first settlers were desperate. Oak Ridge was struggling, its land barren, its crops failing. And then they found the lake. They believed it was a gift, a source of life. But it came with a price. They offered it sacrifices, people, animals, anything the lake demanded. Ivy felt her stomach turn. And that's what's been happening all these years. The disappearances, the blackening of the water. Malcolm nodded grimly. Every decade, the lake demands a new offering. A life, a soul. And it's always been someone tied to the town. Someone whose blood is linked to the original settlers. Over the years, the sacrifices became harder to bear, more brutal, until people stopped speaking of it, stopped acknowledging the truth. But it's still there. The pact is still in place. Ivy's mind raced as she tried to process what he was saying. "And you think it's calling for me? Why? Why now?" Malcolm's voice faltered for a moment. "Because your blood is tied to it, Ivy. You're one of the last living descendants of the original settlers. You've always been marked." The weight of his words crashed down on her like a tidal wave. Her mind went blank, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "No, that's not possible. My family, they never mentioned anything like that. I've never—" "You have to believe me," Malcolm interrupted, his voice shaking with emotion. "You've been drawn here for a reason. The lake, it's been waiting for you." Ivy's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to wrap her mind around the revelation. Her family had never spoken of such a thing. She had no idea she was tied to the lake, tied to this curse. But now it seemed there was no escaping it. She had been marked. She had always been marked, and now the lake was calling her. Ivy sat in the dimly lit study, her mind a swirling maelstrom of disbelief and horror. The words Malcolm had just spoken, words that had shattered everything she thought she knew about herself, echoed in her ears. Her blood, the blood of the town's first settlers, was tied to the lake. The lake had been calling to her, choosing her as its next sacrifice, the next offering to appease its dark and ancient hunger. She felt the weight of his revelation settle deep into her bones, the room spinning around her as if the walls themselves were closing in. It couldn't be true. How could it be true? Her family had never spoken of this. Her parents, distant as they were, had never mentioned any kind of curse, any connection to Oak Ridge's dark past. Ivy had been a stranger to this town, to its history, only seeking refuge here to escape a life broken by her own mistakes. But now it seemed that fate had chosen her long before she had ever arrived. Malcolm's gaze was steady but filled with the kind of sorrow Ivy had not expected. He had known who she was, what she was tied to all along. He had watched her struggle, watched the darkness close in on her, and yet he had not intervened, not fully. A chill ran through Ivy at the realization that her arrival in Oak Ridge had not been a random act. Why didn't you tell me? Ivy's voice was barely a whisper, thick with disbelief and pain. Malcolm sighed, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the glass of water on the table. He took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving Ivy's face. I couldn't. I've spent my life trying to protect this town from the truth that the lake is not just a part of Oak Ridge. It is Oak Ridge. And as much as we might want to ignore it, we can't. The bloodline that founded this town is the one that keeps it alive. Ivy's mind reeled, her chest tightening. So, you knew what was happening to the people who disappeared. You knew what this place was built on. And you did nothing. I tried, Malcolm's voice cracked. But the power of the lake, it's more than any of us can understand. We believed that over time, the sacrifices could be forgotten, that the town could break free from the curse, but it's never that simple. The lake is patient. It waits for the right moment, for the right blood. Ivy recoiled. And you never thought to tell me, to warn me that I was walking into the trap? I never wanted to put you in this position, Malcolm whispered, his voice strained with regret. But the pull of the lake, Ivy, it's inevitable. Your bloodline is the last to be touched by its power. Once the sacrifice has been made, the town can rest until the next generation. I don't want to be its sacrifice. Ivy shot back, standing abruptly, her voice breaking. I don't want any of this. Malcolm's face was drawn, his expression pained. I know, but running from it won't help. The lake won't let you go. It's already too late for that. Ivy's breath hitched as she stepped back, feeling the suffocating weight of the truth pressing down on her chest. The realization that she was tethered to the lake, that she was its next victim, was too much to bear. Why me? Why now? She managed, her voice trembling. Malcolm stood up slowly, his old bones creaking as he came to stand in front of her. The lake has always been tied to this land, to the people who live here. Each sacrifice is meant to renew the power of Oak Ridge, to make sure the land is fertile, that the town thrives. But every decade, the sacrifices become more desperate, more violent, and every decade the curse grows stronger. Ivy stared at him, trying to piece together the fragments of the town's history, the twisted roots of Oak Ridge. So, what do I do now? Do I just surrender, become the next offering? Malcolm shook his head slowly. You can't fight it, Ivy. No one ever has. Those who tried disappeared. Then what am I supposed to do? Ivy demanded, the edge of hysteria creeping into her voice. If there's no way out, why am I even here? Why did I come? Malcolm didn't answer. At first, his eyes distant, as though looking through her and into the past. Finally, he spoke again, his voice softer, almost as if he were revealing something he had kept buried for too long. There is one way, he said, his tone heavy with sorrow. But it requires more than just blood. It requires a choice. Ivy stared at him, a chill running through her. A choice? Malcolm nodded slowly, his eyes dark. The lake's curse isn't just about sacrifice, it's about balance. The original settlers believed that for the land to thrive, they had to give the lake something of equal value. And it wasn't always just blood. Sometimes it was something deeper, something that would weigh on the soul. Each sacrifice, each offering was meant to appease the lake, to satisfy its hunger. But it's always been a matter of what is given in return. Ivy's mind whirled. You mean, if I offer something else, something beyond my life, the lake will leave me alone? Perhaps, Malcolm said quietly. But there is no certainty. The lake is fickle. It feeds on guilt, on grief, on regret. It will take what it needs regardless of your intentions. The choice is yours, Ivy. You must decide what you are willing to give in exchange for your freedom. Ivy sank back into the chair, her mind spiraling. She had to make a choice. But what did she have left to give? She was already broken by the loss of her past, torn by the emotional wreckage of her life. Her guilt, her regrets, they weighed on her more heavily than anything she could name. Was that what the lake wanted? Her guilt, her grief? Was there anything she could offer that would stop the curse from consuming her? I don't know what to do, she whispered, her voice cracking. I don't know if I can make the right choice. Malcolm's eyes softened, his voice full of empathy. No one ever does, and that's why the lake always wins. A cold silence fell between them, and Ivy felt the oppressive weight of the lake's presence grow stronger with every passing second. She had to decide. She had no time left. Whatever I choose, she whispered, it has to be enough. Malcolm nodded solemnly. It will be. It has to be. The days following her conversation with Malcolm felt like a fog, a blur of confusion, fear, and dread. Ivy could feel the weight of the curse pressing in on her from all sides, the lake's call louder with each passing moment. The whispers had become more persistent, now impossible to ignore, always just beneath the surface of her thoughts, like a dark, insistent hum in the back of her mind. The question of what she would sacrifice and how she could escape the lake's grasp had become the only thing that mattered, consuming her every waking moment, invading her every dream. The town itself had grown eerily silent, the once bustling streets now almost deserted. The people of Oakridge moved about with a quiet, desperate determination, as though they too could feel the inevitable pull of the lake creeping ever closer. It was as if the whole town had gone into hiding, preparing for something dark and unavoidable. Ivy hadn't returned to the lake since the night she'd encountered Isabella's ghostly apparition. But she could feel its presence everywhere, in the silence of the town, in the thick air that pressed down on her, in the deep, unsettling darkness that seemed to hang over the land like a shadow. It was time. The knowledge that the lake was bound to her, that her bloodline had always been tied to its dark, insatiable hunger, left Ivy with little room for doubt. She had to confront it. She had to face the entity that had been watching her, waiting for her all her life. But how? How could she confront something so vast, so ancient, something that thrived on human suffering, that drew its power from the guilt and remorse of those who came near it. Ivy had spent hours poring over the text Malcolm had provided, the ancient tomes and books that spoke of the lake's creation, its influence over Oakridge. She had tried to find a solution, a ritual, anything that would give her the upper hand. But the more she searched, the more it became clear. The only way to break the curse was to satisfy the lake's hunger, to offer something in exchange for freedom. And the cost, the price of that freedom, was more than she could bear. Ivy stood on the edge of the town, looking down at the fog that swirled over the lake. The water was dark, its surface smooth and reflective in the dim light of the dying afternoon. It felt alive, breathing in rhythm with the town, with her, as though it was waiting for her to come closer. She felt its pull again, that heavy, suffocating force dragging her toward it. She was caught in its current, unable to resist. It was then that she saw him. Dylan. He was standing by the shore, staring at the water with a haunted look in his eyes, as though he were waiting for something, or someone. Ivy's heart skipped, a beat, and she found herself walking toward him, her steps quickening despite herself. He didn't turn to face her as she approached, his eyes fixed on the lake. His fishing rod, which he had carried around for days, hung limply at his side, unused. "Dylan," she called softly, her voice trembling with the weight of everything she had learned. He didn't respond immediately, and for a moment Ivy thought he hadn't heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, barely a whisper. "I knew you'd come. I knew the lake wouldn't let you go. Ivy's words caught in her throat. She had so many questions, so many things she needed to ask him. But in this moment, it seemed there was only one thing that mattered. "You knew about my bloodline," she said, her voice barely audible. "You knew I was tied to the lake, that it was always going to come for me, didn't you?" Dylan turned slowly, his eyes haunted, his face pale. "I knew," he said quietly. "My father disappeared in the lake. But it wasn't just the water that took him. It was the blood that called him. Your blood is the last to be claimed by the lake. Your family is tied to it, just like mine." Ivy felt her chest tighten, the weight of the truth crashing down on her. "So what do I do?" she asked, her voice breaking. "What am I supposed to do now that it's come for me? What choice do I have?" Dylan stepped closer, his eyes filled with something like regret. "You have to make a sacrifice. It's the only way to stop the lake from claiming you." "I don't have anything left to give," Ivy whispered. "I've already lost everything." Dylan reached out, his hand trembling as he placed it on her shoulder. "You have to face the lake, Ivy. You have to make the choice." "What choice?" Ivy asked, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "There's no choice. The lake doesn't give you a choice." "There is one," Dylan said, his voice firm now. "The lake can only claim you if you let it. But if you face it, if you confront it and offer it something of your own, something that it can't take, you can break the curse." Ivy's mind spun. "Offer it what? What could I possibly give that would stop it from taking me?" Dylan's gaze softened. "You've already given it your guilt, your regrets. That's what it feeds on. But you can fight it. You can fight it by letting go of what you've carried. The lake wants your darkness. It thrives on it. If you let go of everything that binds you to it, you can break its hold." For a long moment, Ivy stood there staring at Dylan, trying to comprehend what he was saying. Let go of her guilt, her regret, the burden that had carried her for so long. Could it really be that simple? "I don't know if I can," Ivy whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't know how." Dylan's expression softened, and for the first time he seemed to understand. "I know. It's hard. But you can't keep carrying it, Ivy. Not when the lake is waiting. Ivy looked out at the lake, its surface like glass, reflecting the dimming sky. The whispers had grown louder, and she could almost hear them now, urging her to come closer. The water was waiting. It had always been waiting for her. She felt the pull again, stronger this time, as if the lake were calling her, beckoning her to step into its depths, to surrender. But this time something was different. The choice Dylan spoke of. It wasn't about fighting the lake. It was about confronting her own demons, her own past, and choosing to let them go. She had spent so long holding on to her guilt, to her mistakes. The weight of her past had shaped who she was, but she didn't have to let it define her. With a deep breath, Ivy stepped forward, moving closer to the water. The air was thick, and the whispers seemed to be all around her now, urging her on. She reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered just above the dark surface. And then, for the first time, she felt it. Her heart lightening, the pressure in her chest easing as she let go. Let go of the regret, of the mistakes that had followed her for so long. The lake's call grew quieter. Ivy stood at the edge of the lake, her heart pounding in her chest as the whispers faded into the distance, the oppressive weight of guilt and regret lifting ever so slightly from her soul. The surface of the water, once so dark and forbidding, seemed to shimmer now, reflecting the pale light of the moon above. Though the fog still clung to the land like a heavy blanket, it felt different somehow. Not as cold, not as hungry. But even with the relief she felt, she knew it wasn't over yet. The lake was still waiting, still watching, as if testing her resolve, as if it could sense that her battle wasn't yet won. "I don't know if I can do this," Ivy whispered to herself, her voice trembling with the weight of what she had just chosen. She had let go of her guilt, her burdens, the darkness that had haunted her for so long. But in doing so, had she truly freed herself? Or was she simply opening herself up to the lake's insatiable hunger? Behind her, Dylan's voice interrupted her thoughts, his tone softer than before. "You're doing it, Ivy. You've already made the hardest choice. The lake feeds on your regret, your guilt, and now you're letting it go. That's the sacrifice. You're giving it something it can't take." Ivy glanced at him, her heart heavy with a mixture of doubt and hope. "But is it enough? Will it really let me go?" Dylan didn't respond immediately, his eyes locked on the stillness of the water. The lake doesn't let go easily, but it can't feed on what you no longer give it. It's always been about your connection to the past, your bloodline, your mistakes. But now, you've chosen something else. You've chosen to fight, and that's what makes you different from the others. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Ivy wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that she had done enough. But something in the back of her mind still whispered that the lake's hunger could never truly be satisfied. It would never be that simple. As if in answer to her doubts, the water began to stir again, a subtle ripple that slowly expanded outward. The whispers returned, but this time they were not distant or soft. They were sharp, urgent, a chorus of voices calling to her from beneath the surface. Ivy. The voice that called her name was no longer just Isabella's, but a blend of many voices, some familiar, some alien, all intertwined in a cacophony of sorrow and longing. Ivy felt her chest tighten as the lake began to churn, its surface darkening. Once more, as if responding to her presence. "Come to us," the voices urged, their tone more insistent now, more desperate. Ivy stepped back, fear creeping into her chest once again. She had to do this. She had to finish what she had started, no matter the cost. She couldn't let herself be consumed by the lake. Not again. But the pull was too strong, the weight of the water's presence suffocating. It was as though the lake was trying to drag her down, to claim her the way it had claimed so many others. The darkness beneath the surface swirled, twisting into shapes, into faces, into memories. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw them. Images of people who had disappeared over the years, their faces contorted in pain, their eyes wide with terror. They reached out to her, their hands emerging from the water, clawing at the air as if begging for release. But Ivy couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, trapped between her choice and the lake's power. "Let go, Ivy." Dylan's voice came again, this time more forceful, more urgent. "You've made the choice. The lake can only take what you offer. You don't have to give it anything else." Ivy clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she forced herself to step forward. She could feel the weight of the water pulling her toward it, dragging her into its depths. But she had made her decision. She had given the lake all she could, her regret, her guilt, her dark past. She had nothing left to give. "No more," she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear that surged through her. "You won't take me." With a final breath, Ivy stepped into the water. The cold hit her like a shock, the water creeping up her legs, then her waist as she waded deeper. Her heart raced as the whispers grew louder, louder still, until they were all around her, filling her ears, drowning her in their insistent call. The lake was no longer just water. It was alive. It was memory. It was hunger. It wanted her. But Ivy pushed forward, through the water that seemed to cling to her, that seemed to reach for her, to pull her under. She could feel the lake's presence pressing on her chest, suffocating her with its weight. It wanted her to give in. It wanted her to surrender. But she had already given it everything it wanted, and that was enough. With all her strength, Ivy let go. She let go of the fear, the guilt, the doubts. She released herself from the lake's grip, from the curse that had been passed down through generations. The water around her seemed to still, to quiet, as if acknowledging her sacrifice. For a moment, everything was silent. The whispers stopped. The lake calmed. And in that stillness, Ivy felt a profound sense of peace, a peace that she hadn't known in years. But then, as she stood there in the dark water, she realized the truth of what had just happened. The lake hadn't been vanquished. It hadn't been defeated. The curse wasn't broken. It was only paused. She had given the lake the sacrifice it craved, but she had also freed herself. The lake could no longer take from her what it wanted. She had broken free, for now. But the curse of Oak Ridge would not die so easily, and Ivy knew deep down that the lake would one day rise again. Still here? Brave. Or maybe you just like the feeling of being watched. Like, subscribe, and drop your time and location in the comments, so we know who's still out there. Now breathe slow. The worst is coming. Ivy stood in the stillness of the lake, the water now calm and undisturbed, as though it were holding its breath. The weight of the curse that had pressed down on her for so long seemed to have lifted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe. The oppressive call of the lake was gone, replaced with a sense of quiet emptiness, an eerie peace that hung in the air like the calm after a storm. She had done it. She had faced the lake, faced the darkness of her past, and for now, she had won. But even as the weight of her triumph settled in her chest, there was something else, something deeper, that gnawed at her, a nagging sense of unease that she couldn't shake. The lake was still there, still watching, still waiting. She had broken its hold on her, but the town of Oak Ridge, its people, and its history, everything, was still tied to the cursed waters. The price of her freedom had been paid, but Ivy knew deep down that the cost was not truly gone. The cycle was not over, not yet. With every breath, the fog around her began to recede, lifting from the water as though the lake were giving her space to leave. The mist dissipated, and Ivy stepped back, feeling the cool, slick mud beneath her feet as she waded out of the water. The air felt thick, heavy with something unsaid, but the grip of the lake had loosened for now. Dylan was standing by the shore, waiting for her, his eyes dark with concern, but softened with a quiet hope. The tension in his posture, the wariness in his gaze hadn't completely eased, but there was a sense of relief in him now that hadn't been there before. He was watching her, waiting for her to make sense of what had just happened. Ivy could barely speak. The words caught in her throat as she approached him, her feet sinking into the damp earth. She felt drained, her body heavy with the weight of what she had just done, and yet there was a strange calm in her chest. The water had stopped calling her. The lake had ceased its pursuit, but something still lingered, a nagging feeling that the peace she had gained was temporary, like the eye of a storm. She couldn't help but wonder what the cost would be for the town, for Oakridge, for Dylan. What now? Ivy finally whispered, her voice hoarse from the effort of holding everything inside. She wasn't sure if she was asking Dylan or herself, but she needed to know. She needed to understand what came next. Dylan's gaze softened as he stepped closer to her, his eyes searching hers as if looking for the right words. You've broken the curse for now, Ivy, but you haven't ended it. Not really. Ivy's heart sank as she realized the full weight of what he was saying. The lake had stopped calling her, but the curse of Oakridge was far from broken. The lake feeds on what we give it, Dylan continued. It feeds on our regrets, on the bloodline, on the history of this place. You've stopped it from taking you, but the town is still bound to it. As long as Oakridge exists, as long as this place breathes, the lake will always be there, always waiting. Ivy could feel the weight of his words sinking in. She hadn't broken the cycle. She had only interrupted it. Then what can I do? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What more can be done? Dylan was quiet for a long time, his eyes distant as though he were lost in the town's history, lost in the centuries of pain and suffering tied to the lake's curse. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe the lake can't ever be truly stopped. Maybe it's something that needs to be faced every generation. But you've changed things. You've shown that it doesn't have to take everything. Maybe, with time, the town can learn to live without it. Ivy shook her head, frustration bubbling inside her. But the lake won't stop. I've felt it, Dylan. It won't stop just because I've let go of my guilt. It feeds on something deeper than that. It's something about this place, the land, the people. It's too deep-rooted to be broken by one sacrifice. Dylan didn't answer immediately. He was thinking, his brow furrowed in concentration. The town's history isn't just tied to the lake. It's tied to the people who live here, their beliefs, their choices, their guilt. The lake may be part of Oakridge's story, but Oakridge is still the story of its people. The lake can only feed on what we let it. And maybe, just maybe, the town has been feeding it for too long. Ivy felt her chest tighten at the thought. So what? The only way to break it is to make the town confront itself? To make them face their history? Dylan nodded slowly. The town's bloodline is a part of the curse, but so are the secrets it keeps. The people of Oakridge have been complicit for generations, feeding the lake without ever understanding what they were doing. Maybe it's time for the town to face its past, face the truth of what the lake has always been. If they do that, if they stop hiding from it, maybe they can stop feeding it. Ivy stood there, feeling the weight of his words settle over her like a blanket of cold realization. The curse wasn't just something to be fought, it was something to be understood. It was a legacy, a dark inheritance that could only be broken by confronting the truth. But as she looked at Dylan, something else struck her. The weight of Oakridge's secret history wasn't just a burden on the town, it was on her too. She had been drawn into it, marked by the lake's power, and in doing so, she had unwittingly become a part of its cycle. "I can't fight this alone," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't stop it by myself. I don't even know where to begin." Dylan reached out, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone, Ivy. No one does. The town can't keep hiding from its past, and neither can you. If we face it together, maybe we can change it." The words were simple, but they carried a weight, a promise. Ivy didn't know if she believed it completely. She didn't know if the curse of Oak Ridge could ever truly be broken. But for the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. She turned to face the lake once more, its surface calm and dark. For now it seemed to wait. But Ivy knew that the peace she had found was only temporary. The lake's hunger would never truly go away. It would always be there, lurking beneath the surface, ready to claim its next victim. But this time, Ivy wouldn't be that victim. This time she would fight. She would face the darkness, and maybe, just maybe, she could break the cycle. The days that followed felt as though time had slowed, each moment stretching out longer than the last. Oak Ridge had always been a town steeped in quiet, but now its silence felt deafening, suffocating. Even the usual hum of life, the sound of footsteps, the chatter of neighbors, the mundane noise of daily routines had quieted, leaving an eerie calm that pressed down on Ivy's chest like a weight. The air felt thick with something unspoken, something that hadn't been addressed for generations. And in the midst of it, Ivy knew that there was only one way to confront the past. She had to face Oak Ridge itself. The town had to understand the truth of what had been done, of what had always been done. The curse was rooted not only in the lake, but in the people who had kept its dark history alive. The town's unwillingness to confront the truth had kept it alive, allowing the cycle of guilt, sacrifice, and death to continue unabated. Oak Ridge had been feeding the lake, had been feeding its curse, simply by hiding from the truth. Ivy had spent days in the library with Felicity, combing through old records, diaries, and accounts of the town's founding. They uncovered long-forgotten stories of the settlers, of their desperation and their pact with the lake. But the more Ivy learned, the more she realized that the truth would not be enough to break the curse. The people of Oak Ridge would have to confront the consequences of their actions, their sins, and their silence. They would have to face the blood that had been spilled, the lives that had been lost. And so, Ivy had made a decision. She would call a meeting, gather everyone in the town to face the truth, to confront the darkness that had festered beneath the surface for so long. She didn't know what the outcome would be, didn't know if anyone would believe her. But she couldn't live with the knowledge that Oak Ridge would continue to be trapped in the grip of the lake, waiting for the next sacrifice. The town hall was old, the wood creaking beneath the weight of decades of history. Ivy stood at the front, facing the crowd of people who had gathered in silence, their faces somber and uncertain. She could feel the weight of their gazes on her, the skepticism, the fear. They had heard the rumors, the stories, the whispers of the curse. But they had never truly believed it. At least, not until now. Malcolm Pierce was there, standing at the back, his face drawn with the weight of what he knew. Felicity stood beside him, her eyes wide, filled with uncertainty and dread. Dylan was there too, though he seemed to carry the same quiet strength as always, a reminder of the town's legacy, of its bloodline, and of the lake that had claimed so much. "I know you all have heard the stories," Ivy began, her voice steady but low, as though the weight of the truth made it difficult to speak. "You know the rumors, the whispers about the lake, the disappearances, the blackening, the curse that's been passed down through generations. And for years we've tried to ignore it, to pretend that it was just superstition. But I'm here to tell you that it's not just a story, it's real, and it's time we face the truth. The room shifted, murmurs rising in the crowd as people exchanged uneasy glances. Ivy held her ground, unwilling to let the fear that had plagued her for so long take hold again. She had fought for this moment. She had come to terms with her own past, her own darkness. She could not allow them to keep hiding from theirs. The lake isn't just a body of water, she continued, her voice rising with the conviction that had been building inside her for days. It's a force, an entity that has fed on our guilt, our regret, our sacrifices for generations. The people of Oak Ridge made a pact with it, an offering of blood in exchange for survival. And every decade, the lake demands more, and we've been feeding it without even realizing what we were doing. The murmurs grew louder, some of the townspeople shifting uncomfortably, others speaking in hushed voices, but Ivy didn't falter. She couldn't. I'm here to tell you that the cycle can't continue. We can't keep feeding the lake with our fear, with our silence. We've all been complicit in this curse. We've all allowed it to go on for far too long. But it's time for Oak Ridge to confront its past. Ivy paused, her eyes scanning the room, meeting the gaze of every person who had gathered. Some were young, some old, but they all carried the weight of their ancestors' choices. They all carried the knowledge that the lake's power had been passed down, generation after generation, and that it was now in their hands to either break the cycle or perpetuate it. There is no easy way out, she said softly. The lake won't stop just because we want it to. The curse won't end just because we close our eyes to it. But we can face it. We can confront the truth and stop feeding it with our silence. The room was silent, the weight of her words settling on everyone's shoulders like a heavy cloud. Ivy didn't expect anyone to immediately agree, to suddenly believe in the truth she had laid bare. But she had to try. She had to make them understand. I know it's not easy, she said, her voice quieter now, filled with a tenderness that seemed to soften the tension in the room. But we have to face what we've done. We have to acknowledge the blood that has been spilled in the name of survival, in the name of keeping this town alive. And we have to choose to stop. We have to choose to let go of the curse. For a long moment the room was still. No one moved, no one spoke, and Ivy feared for a second that the silence meant they would never listen, that Oak Ridge would continue to live in the shadow of its past. But then, slowly, one by one, people began to stand. It was a quiet gesture, hesitant at first, but as more stood, the weight of the decision began to shift. Malcolm Pierce was the first to speak, his voice low but firm. I've spent my life hiding from the truth, trying to keep the town's secrets buried. But Ivy's right, it's time we stopped running. Felicity too nodded, her voice quiet but filled with a conviction that surprised Ivy. We can't keep letting the lake take from us. We have to face it. For the people who've disappeared, for those who've been lost. And then Dylan stepped forward, his expression set, his hands at his sides. The town can't be saved unless we save it together. I'm with you, Ivy. We face the past. We face the lake. One by one, the people of Oak Ridge stood, their voices rising with determination. It wasn't a chorus of unanimous agreement. It was the beginning of a reckoning. A reckoning that Oak Ridge had been avoiding for centuries. They had seen the truth. They had acknowledged their complicity in the curse. And now, they were ready to face it. Ivy looked around at the people of Oak Ridge, the weight of their shared history on her shoulders. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. The lake still waited, still watched. But now, it was no longer the only force in Oak Ridge. Now there was a new force, and it was the people of Oak Ridge. united in their choice to face the truth, to confront the curse, and to stop feeding it. The night had fallen thick and heavy around Oakridge, the town now a shadowed silhouette against the dark sky. The once familiar streets were veiled in mist, their contours blurred as if the town itself had faded into the folds of time. Ivy stood at the center of it all, her heart pounding in her chest as she prepared to face the final test, the reckoning with the lake. The townspeople had rallied together in a way Ivy hadn't thought possible just days ago. The meeting had ignited something within them, a spark of understanding that they could no longer hide from their past, nor from the curse that had held Oakridge in its grip for centuries. The people of Oakridge had agreed. This night, they would confront the lake, confront the darkness that had consumed their town for generations. But Ivy knew it wouldn't be easy. The lake wasn't just a body of water. It was a presence, a force that thrived on their silence, their guilt, and their fear. It was a hunger that would not be easily appeased, not even with the strength of the entire town behind them. The blood of the settlers, the sacrifices that had been made, the pacts sealed long ago. They all lay beneath the surface, tangled in the roots of Oakridge's history, waiting to be released. Ivy looked around at the people who had come to stand with her. Dylan stood beside her, his face determined, his eyes steady. Felicity was close, her hands clenched in resolve, her gaze fixed on the water. Malcolm too was present, his expression grave but filled with a quiet strength. The town's people were behind them, some hesitant, some terrified, but all here, ready to face what had been hidden for too long. The lake lay ahead, dark and silent, its surface rippling only with the faintest of winds. It was as if the water itself were holding its breath, waiting for them to make the first move, waiting to see if they would succumb to its pull once more. Ivy could feel its presence, its suffocating weight pressing down on her, on them all. But now, with the weight of Oakridge's people standing with her, she felt the smallest flicker of hope. The lake could no longer hold power over them, not if they stood united. "We can do this," Dylan said, his voice low but firm. "We've already taken the first step." Ivy nodded, though her heart was heavy. "We have to finish it tonight. The curse won't stop until it's fed, until it gets what it wants. But we can stop it. Together." Malcolm stepped forward, his voice quiet but strong. "This isn't just about confronting the lake, Ivy. It's about confronting ourselves. It's about facing the sins that have been passed down through the generations. We've all been part of this in one way or another. And now, we all need to make it right." The town gathered closer, standing on the edge of the lake, their faces tense, waiting. Ivy stepped forward, feeling the weight of their gaze upon her, the burden of Oakridge's history heavy on her shoulders. The whispers from the water grew louder now, like a chorus calling out to them, urging them to step back, to retreat. But Ivy wouldn't let fear control her, not this time. "We've hidden from this for too long," Ivy said, her voice steady, despite the fear still coiling in her stomach. "But tonight, we face it. We face the curse. We face the lake." The whispers grew sharper, more insistent, as if the lake were already beginning to fight back, unwilling to give up its hold over them. But Ivy felt a surge of something, an unspoken strength, a bond between herself and the people of Oakridge. The lake was no longer an immovable force. It was just water, and water could be changed. Slowly, one by one, the townspeople began to step forward, their voices low as they whispered their own confessions, their own acknowledgements of the guilt that had been passed down to them. Felicity was the first, stepping forward to stand beside Ivy, her voice trembling as she spoke, but steady in its resolution. "We have allowed this to happen. We've kept silent, afraid to face the truth, but no more." Next, Dylan joined her, his voice unwavering. "We've been feeding this darkness for too long. It's time we stop." Malcolm's voice, rough and old, filled the air, thick with sorrow. "We've all been part of this curse, whether we knew it or not. But tonight, we make it right." One by one, the people of Oakridge stepped forward, each one speaking their own truth, acknowledging their part in the dark history of the town. The words they spoke were heavy, laden with the weight of generations of silence. But they were freeing themselves. They were breaking the hold the lake had on them. The whispers from the lake grew louder, more furious, as if the entity beneath the water could feel the change. Ivy stepped forward, standing on the very edge of the water, feeling its cold presence, wrapping around her like a noose. But she didn't flinch. She didn't back down. "Tonight, we take back what is ours," Ivy declared, her voice rising. "We take back Oakridge. We take back our lives. The lake's power ends tonight." The water began to stir, a shadow rising beneath its surface, undulating like a great beast waking from slumber. Ivy could see it now, faces twisted and distorted, rising from the depths, their eyes wide and empty, their mouths gaping in silent screams. The ghosts of the past, the sacrifices, the souls the lake had claimed over the centuries, they were all rising now, summoned by the words spoken by the people of Oakridge. Ivy stepped forward into the water, her feet sinking into the cold muck beneath, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the lake's hunger, its power reaching for her, trying to pull her under. But she fought back, pushing against the darkness with everything she had. "I will not be your sacrifice," Ivy shouted, her voice strong and defiant. "I am not your prey. I am not your offering. I am free." The water around her began to churn violently, the figures rising from the depths as the lake's fury reached its peak. The voices screamed, their desperate cries echoing in the air, but Ivy's voice rang out above them all. "No more," she screamed. "No more fear, no more guilt, no more sacrifices." As the words left her lips, the lake seemed to recoil, as if struck by a force stronger than it could resist. The water began to calm, the ripples fading into stillness, the figures sinking back into the depths from which they had risen. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. The air was thick, heavy with the aftermath of the battle that had just taken place, but the lake no longer felt like a presence. It felt like water, like something that could be controlled, something that could be healed. And for the first time, Ivy felt free. The curse was broken, the lake had been faced. The town of Oakridge had confronted its past, and the cycle of fear and sacrifice had come to an end. But Ivy knew that the lake would always be a part of the land, a part of the history of Oakridge. The battle was over for now, but Oakridge would always have to remember, always have to confront its past, its sins and its choices. The cycle could never truly be forgotten, but for tonight at least, Oakridge was free. The night stretched on, its heavy silence punctuated only by the soft murmur of wind through the trees and the distant sounds of water lapping against the shore. The town of Oakridge stood still, as if it too were holding its breath. It was a town forever changed, forever marked by the reckoning that had taken place just hours ago. The lake, once an unstoppable force of hunger and darkness, now lay silent, its power broken, for now. Ivy stood at the edge of the water, her legs trembling beneath her, the cold dampness of the earth seeping through her boots. The figures that had risen from the depths, the souls lost to the lake's insatiable pull, had disappeared, sinking back into the water's inky blackness. She could still feel the weight of their presence, the echoes of their screams lingering in the air. But they were no longer haunting her, no longer pulling at her soul. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ivy felt a lightness in her chest, a sense of peace she hadn't known she could ever possess. "Is it really over?" she whispered to herself, the question hanging in the stillness like a fragile thread. She turned to Dylan, who had remained silent beside her, watching the water with a quiet intensity. He hadn't moved, hadn't looked away from the lake since the moment the tide had turned. Dylan's voice was soft when he finally spoke. "It's over, Ivy, for now." His words, simple yet weighted with truth, settled heavily in the air between them. There was no finality, no certainty. They had faced the lake, but the lake's power was like the land itself, rooted in the soil of Oak Ridge, in the very heart of the town. To truly defeat it, to truly end the cycle, would require more than just a single confrontation. It would require a change that ran deeper than the water's depths. "We broke the curse," Ivy said, her voice quiet but firm, as if saying it aloud might make it true. "We faced it. We confronted the darkness that had haunted this town for so long. The lake, it can't take any more." Dylan's gaze never wavered, his eyes locked on the water, the shadows beneath it, the memory of everything they had fought against. The lake feeds on guilt, on sacrifice. But it's not just the people of Oak Ridge it feeds on. It feeds on the silence, the fear. It needs us to stay hidden, to stay in the shadows, and we let it happen for too long. Ivy nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle deep within her. They had confronted the lake's hunger, yes, but they had also confronted the town's silence. The fear that had kept Oak Ridge trapped for generations had been shattered. The people of the town, those who had dared to stand with her, had broken free from the lake's grip, but the work was far from finished. "We can't go back to the way things were," Ivy said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "We have to keep moving forward. We have to keep confronting our past, not just the lake's curse, but everything that's tied to it. The people who disappeared, the choices made, the secrets kept." Dylan finally turned to her, his expression softening, though the weight of the town's history was still heavy in his eyes. "You're right. The curse didn't end with us. It'll take all of Oak Ridge to heal. But we've started, and that's more than anyone's done before." Ivy's heart swelled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. She had fought, she had faced the darkness, and for now, the curse had been broken. But she knew that Oak Ridge was far from healed. The town had to learn to live with its history, to confront the choices it had made. And it had to begin by confronting the truth. The truth was that the lake would never truly be gone. The curse wasn't a thing to be vanquished. It was a part of Oak Ridge's very existence. But the town could choose now to live without hiding from it. They could choose to face the darkness not with fear, but with understanding. And that was a beginning. Ivy turned back toward the town, the dim light of the first light of dawn creeping across the horizon, bathing the world in a soft, muted glow. The lake behind her seemed still, its surface reflecting the pale light, calm and undisturbed. It was as if it had accepted its defeat, its hunger momentarily sated. But Ivy knew it was watching, waiting, for when the people of Oak Ridge might falter, for when the cycle might begin again, but not today. "Are we ready?" Ivy asked, her voice low as she looked at Dylan, her heart beating steadily, though the weight of the world still pressed on her. Dylan gave a slow nod, his expression resolute. "We're ready. We can face it. We'll face it together." The others, Malcolm, Felicity, the townspeople, were already gathering behind them, their faces tired but filled with quiet strength. The air was still thick with the weight of the past, but it was no longer suffocating. The town had taken its first step toward healing, and Ivy knew that whatever came next, she would not face it alone. Oak Ridge had been freed, but it was still a town haunted by its history, by its choices. The lake's curse would never be fully broken, but the people of Oak Ridge had learned the truth, and with that knowledge came the power to change. to choose. The first light of dawn illuminated the town, the fog lifting as the sun rose higher into the sky. The town, once trapped in darkness, was now bathed in the soft glow of morning. For the first time in a long while, Ivy felt a sliver of hope. The curse wasn't gone, but they were no longer afraid, and maybe that was enough. The fog returned 3 nights later. It slipped in after dusk like a pale intruder, threading through the forest like breath held too long. Ivy stood by her window, watching it crawl across the earth, seeping through cracks in the road, around tree trunks, under porch steps. It didn't move like natural fog. It crept. It remembered. Down by the lake, the water had remained calm since the confrontation, still and glassy, with none of the deep churn that had once seemed to pulse with hunger. But Ivy couldn't shake the feeling that beneath that stillness, the lake was watching. She hadn't been back to the shore since the town had gathered and spoken their truths aloud, since the voices had risen from the black water and the spectral hands had reached for her soul. But she still felt it, in her bones, in her dreams. The lake was quiet, yes, but not sleeping. It was remembering. That night, Ivy's dream returned. She stood not on the modern shore, but on a stretch of jagged rock. The sky was low and bruised purple, the wind cutting like glass. Around her stood the original settlers of Oakridge, men and women in coarse garments, their faces weathered, their hands clutching torches that spat orange light into the fog. They were chanting. Ivy couldn't understand the words, but the cadence was unmistakable. Ritual. Their eyes were wide with something between reverence and terror, fixed not on the lake, but on a woman standing at its edge. Her hair was long and dark, her back to the crowd, her arms raised high. Ivy knew her Isabella. The lake lapped at the woman's bare feet as she spoke in a voice too ancient for Ivy to fully hear, too hollow to be human. When she stepped into the water, the chanting stopped. All was silent, except for the slow ripple that spread across the surface, and then Isabella turned. Her face wasn't her own. It was Ivy's. Ivy jolted awake, her throat raw with a scream she hadn't realized she'd released. Her sheets were soaked with sweat, her chest heaving. She reached instinctively for her journal and scribbled what she could remember before it slipped away. She didn't know if it was just a dream or something deeper, some echo of what the lake had shown her before. But one thing was clear, the lake remembered, and it was beginning to show her what it had kept buried. By mid-morning, Ivy was back at the library. The pages of The Waters Beneath spread across the long reading table, every candle-lit word scouring her for a deeper truth. Felicity hovered nearby, tired but alert, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her cardigan. "You said Isabella was the last to die before the blackening started?" Ivy asked, flipping through a brittle page that detailed the timeline of Oakridge's oldest families. "Yes," Felicity said. "She was drowned, or sacrificed, depending on which story you believe. After that, the lake's behavior changed. It stopped being a source of life. The fish vanished. The crops near the water turned bitter." Ivy traced a long list of names, handwritten down one of the margins. Early Oakridge families: Barrett, Reeve, Pierce. "They used her to seal the pact, didn't they?" Ivy whispered. "Isabella wasn't just a victim. She was the offering that bound the lake to the land." Felicity swallowed. "My grandmother believed the same. She said Isabella was a seer, that she warned the town about the lake, begged them not to perform the ritual, but they thought she was cursed, so they made her the sacrifice." Ivy shut the book. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. "They silenced her," she said. "They murdered her to protect themselves, and then they rewrote the story to make her into a willing offering." Felicity's voice trembled. "What do we do with that?" Ivy stood, her hands flat on the old wood. We dig it up. By evening, the town square was once again full. The people of Oak Ridge came not because they were told to, but because the air had shifted. The lake had gone quiet too fast. It had accepted the town's reckoning too easily. And now it was remembering. Ivy stood before them, a folder of pages. In her hands, her voice steady despite the pit growing in her stomach. "The truth we faced days ago was only the beginning," she said. "The lake isn't just cursed, it was forced into what it became. The original settlers murdered a woman who tried to stop them. Her name was Isabella. She wasn't a monster. She was a warning." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Malcolm stood in the back, his head bowed. Dylan stood nearby, his arms crossed, eyes on Ivy alone. "The curse didn't begin with blood spilled by the lake," she continued. "It began with betrayal, with fear. The town offered her to something they didn't understand, and in doing so created the very force we've been trying to survive ever since." Someone from the crowd spoke, an older woman with a lined face and eyes the color of storm water. "And now, what do we do now that we know?" Ivy looked toward the lake, just visible past the rows of rooftops. The mist had returned, but it hadn't crept closer. It was circling. "We remember," Ivy said. "We stop rewriting the past to make ourselves feel safe. We carve her name into stone. We speak the truth. And we give the lake what it was denied." "What does it want now?" the woman asked. Ivy's voice dropped. "It wants to be seen." That night, Ivy and a small group returned to the lake's edge. They carried with them an offering, but not of blood, not of fear. They carried a stone plaque, carved with a single name, Isabella Hartfield, keeper of the truth, taken but not silenced. They placed it at the water's edge, just where the ripples reached, and stood in silence. No chanting, no rituals, just the sound of wind and water and grief. The fog moved slowly that night. It circled, and then it began to lift. Not fully, not forever, but for the first time, it stepped back. The morning after the plaque was laid at the lake's edge, Oak Ridge awoke to silence. Not the uneasy, waiting kind that had blanketed the town for decades, but a true silence, clean, unburdened, as if something that had been groaning beneath. The surface of the land had finally exhaled. Ivy stood barefoot at her window, watching the fog dissolve into threads of mist between the trees. The lake, just visible beyond the tree line, looked unnervingly still. Not dead. Alive in a different way. It no longer felt like a mouth waiting to open. She turned as a knock echoed through her rented cabin. When she opened the door, Dylan stood there, his boots muddy, his eyes brighter than she'd seen them since they'd met. "You feel it?" he asked. Ivy nodded. "It's different. I can breathe. I think we all can." He handed her a folded newspaper. The headline wasn't large or dramatic. Oak Ridge didn't do drama, but it was stark and unmistakable. Plaque unveiled, honoring Isabella Hartfield. The keeper of the truth. Below the headline was a photograph of the stone. It's etched, name catching the morning sun, a single crow perched beside it like a witness. Ivy traced her finger down the ink. The town had printed it, acknowledged it. They had said her name aloud. The silence had been broken. Later that afternoon, Ivy walked to the lake with Felicity, Malcolm, and a few others. They didn't speak much. The gravel crunched beneath their feet. The trees overhead swayed gently, and the wind no longer carried the subtle moan of grief it once had. When they reached the water's edge, Ivy stopped. Something had changed. The shoreline had receded. Where the lake once crept up to the moss-covered stones and crooked roots, there was now a bare stretch of dark, glistening soil. The water had pulled back a full 5 feet, revealing a shelf of mud and algae-stained stone that hadn't been seen in generations. It looked as if the lake had taken a step backward. Malcolm let out a soft, choked breath. "It's retreating." "No," Ivy said, her voice low. "It's releasing." They moved closer, cautiously, as if expecting the lake to surge forward, again. But the water remained still. Sunlight caught the surface like glass, revealing something more beneath. Fragments of stone, twisted roots, something pale and sharp jutting from the mud like a skeletal finger. "What is that?" Felicity whispered. They approached slowly, boots sinking into the muck, until they stood above it. It was a carving. Half buried in silt and algae, obscured by time, was a circular stone, its surface etched with a crude spiral and unfamiliar symbols that curled in on themselves like knots of grief. Ivy knelt, brushing away the muck. The markings were weathered but unmistakably intentional. It wasn't just a carving. It was a seal. "A boundary," Malcolm murmured, his voice brittle. "From the original ritual. They didn't just offer her to the lake, they anchored something. They bound it." Ivy traced the grooves, her fingers tingling with a strange static. The moment her skin touched the center of the spiral, she heard it. A low hum, deep and mournful, like a cello string plucked far beneath the earth. She gasped and pulled back, and the sound vanished. "It's still alive," she whispered. "Whatever they bound, it's still here, still watching." Felicity crouched beside her. "But it's contained. That's why the lake pulled back. It's acknowledging the truth. It's letting go of the hunger, but it's still keeping the memory." Ivy looked up at her. "We didn't kill the curse. We named it. And that," Malcolm said, "might be the only way it could ever be laid to rest." That night, Ivy sat by the hearth in her cabin, the pages of The Waters Beneath open in her lap. But she wasn't reading. Not anymore. The words had given her all they could. Instead, she was writing. She began not with the lake, not with the bloodlines or the rituals, but with Isabella, with her voice, with the lies that had buried her, and the truth that had pulled her back to the surface. As the fire crackled beside her, Ivy wrote not to banish the past, but to witness it, to honor it, to preserve it. And in doing so, she found herself breathing deeper, freer, because the lake didn't need to be forgotten. It needed to be remembered correctly. Down by the water, the plaque still stood. The mist curled gently around it, but did not cling. The spiral seal remained uncovered, untouched, dormant. The lake, for the first time in over a century, was still. It no longer needed to feed. It had been heard, and for now, that was enough. It was the fourth night after the lake receded when Ivy first realized something wasn't right with Malcolm. He had been quieter than usual, quieter even for a man who had spent his life curating silence. Since the seal had been uncovered, he'd taken to walking the shoreline alone, always at dusk, always with something tucked beneath his arm. Sometimes it was one of the old journals from the library, sometimes it was a yellowed map. Once, Ivy saw him carrying a candle, unlit, held delicately like a relic. At first, she thought it was grief. Malcolm had always borne the weight of Oak Ridge's history, its secrets, its shame. And now that the town had named its guilt, perhaps he didn't know who he was without it. But it was more than that. There was a tightness in his movements, a tension in his face that hadn't been there before. His skin had paled, his voice thinner. Ivy watched him during town meetings, his hands clenched in his lap, his eyes not on the speakers, but somewhere distant, somewhere beneath the waterline. One evening, just as the moon rose like a pale wound over the trees, she found him standing ankle-deep in the lake, his shoes discarded behind him on the stones. He didn't turn, when she approached. "I was wondering when you'd come," he said, his voice calm but far away. "You shouldn't be in there," Ivy said gently. "We don't know if it's safe." He smiled faintly. "Safe? Ivy, it's never been safe, not since the first stone was laid." She hesitated, the fog rolling around her feet, slower now, less invasive, but still present. "What are you looking for?" Malcolm didn't answer at first. Instead, he knelt in the water, dipping one hand beneath the surface. The ripples that spread from his fingers looked different, too wide, too deep. "I've been thinking," he said, "about memory, about what we choose to pass on. You see, when the settlers bound the lake, they didn't just offer Isabella. They offered their knowledge, their understanding of what the lake really was. They erased it from record, made it myth. That's what gave the curse its teeth." Ivy stepped closer, her voice cautious. "But we've brought the truth back." "We faced it," Malcolm nodded. "You did. The town did. But there's more to a curse than history. It has layers, Ivy. The first blood feeds the body. The forgetting feeds the soul." He stood slowly, water dripping from his sleeves. When he turned, Ivy saw it. His eyes were sunken, rimmed with red, as though something had been leeching him from the inside out. "You've felt it, haven't you?" he said. "That low hum beneath your skin, that ache in the bones at night. It's quieter now, but it's not gone. The seal is still warm, still awake." Ivy's throat tightened. "You've been down there?" He didn't deny it. "I've been listening," he whispered, "and it's listening back." Ivy looked past him to where the spiral seal had been uncovered, just beneath the shallows, glinting faintly under the moonlight. The markings seemed to shift slightly in the water as if they were breathing. She could feel it now too, the vibration underfoot, the ancient rhythm ticking beneath the lake bed like a buried clock. "What do you think it wants, Malcolm?" she asked. He smiled, a sad, resigned thing. "I think it wants balance. I think it wants memory. The truth you've given it is only part of what it's owed. You see, the settlers didn't just kill Isabella. They killed her voice. They buried her warnings, her visions. They erased the parts of her that were inconvenient." He paused. "But I remember them." The words chilled her. "You were there when we placed the plaque," she said slowly. "You helped us speak her name. You helped free her." "I helped soothe the wound," Malcolm said, "but the infection's still in the marrow." He waded back toward the shore and sat heavily on a flat stone, the water licking at his ankles. "There's something else buried down there, something she tried to warn them about. A presence beneath the lake, older than the curse, older than Isabella. I don't think it ever wanted her blood. I think it wanted her knowledge. And when they silenced her, it turned on the town." Ivy felt a cold, wet pressure settle on her chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying it's not done with us," Malcolm said. "But it can be, if we give it what it was denied." He opened the satchel beside him and pulled out a stack of brittle, hand-bound papers, journals. Isabella's, or at least transcriptions of them. Ivy recognized the curled script, the symbols in the margins, visions, warnings, dreams that mirrored her own. "I spent years trying to destroy these," he said, "but I couldn't. I didn't know why until now." He held them out to her. "You've been the voice," he said, "but the lake needs a witness, someone to carry the memory forward, someone it doesn't have to chase anymore." Ivy reached for the papers, her hands shaking. "Why me?" Malcolm smiled again, tired, proud. "Because you listened." That night, Ivy placed the journals in a sealed container and walked them to the spiral seal. She did not open the container. She did not chant or bleed or ask for anything. She simply set it down beside the seal, pressed her palm to the spiral once and whispered, "This is what you were owed." The seal pulsed, once, and went still. When she returned the next morning, the shoreline had receded again, another 5 feet. The plaque stood untouched, and Malcolm was gone. His boots remained at the edge of the water, folded neatly, facing outward. Malcolm Pierce's disappearance left behind a silence unlike any Oakridge had ever known. Not the anxious, tight-lipped hush that had haunted the town for generations, the kind born of secrets buried too deep and wounds left to fester, but a hollow, reverent stillness, the kind that follows the closing of a casket. The kind that settles into the bones of a place when something ancient and unfinished is finally laid to rest. Ivy stood at the lake's edge at dawn, staring at his boots. They had remained untouched for 2 days. No footprints in the mud, no sign of struggle. Just the clean, perfect stillness of someone who had chosen to leave. She crouched beside them, not touching, not speaking. There was a respect in her silence. The wind was soft, brushing past her shoulders as if in mourning, and beneath it, the lake lapped quietly, its once black surface now reflecting the first blush of morning gold. Dylan stood behind her, arms folded, eyes lowered. He knew, Ivy said finally. He always knew how it would end. He wasn't afraid, Dylan replied. That's what struck me most. He didn't resist. He surrendered to something. But it wasn't death. She rose slowly. It was memory. He gave himself to it. The shoreline had changed again. The seal was no longer visible, covered now in a fine mossy sediment, as if the lake itself had tucked it in. Ivy didn't try to uncover it. The message had been heard. There was nothing more to demand. Behind her, the town had started to stir. Oakridge hadn't held a funeral. There was no body, no service. Instead, they planted a tree at the edge of the library courtyard, its roots curling into the same soil where Malcolm had spent most of his life documenting the lives of others. Ivy was the one who pressed the first seed into the earth. She didn't speak when she did it. Neither did anyone else. Words they had all come to understand were not always the most sacred offering. Weeks passed. Ivy stayed. She rented a small house off the edge of the main road, a crumbling white cottage whose back windows looked toward the water. She didn't write for a while. Her mind, once frantic with deadlines and loss and obsession, had gone quiet. She walked more, read less, spent her mornings watching the light change on the surface of the lake. People from town stopped by often. Some brought books they thought she might like. Others came with stories, real stories, the kind that had been buried in fear for generations. Ivy didn't press them. She just listened. She became the one people turned to when they wanted to remember. Not because she had all the answers, but because she didn't flinch from the questions. The lake continued to change. By midsummer, its shoreline had pulled back more than 10 feet. The black water had lightened to a deep silvery hue, and fish, small, flashing things Ivy didn't recognize, had returned. Children began to walk its edge again, cautiously at first, then with laughter. Ivy watched them from her back porch, and some nights she imagined the lake watching too, not with malice, but with awareness. Not every part of Oakridge healed. Some homes remained empty. Some eyes still avoided the water, and there were still whispers, still dreams, visions that came not from fear, but from remembering. But Ivy no longer woke in a cold sweat. When she dreamt of Isabella now, the woman no longer stood in water up to her chest, pleading. She stood on the shore, dry, silent, and watching the sunrise. One evening, Dylan joined Ivy on her porch, 2 steaming mugs in hand. I heard the seal's almost completely covered now, he said. Ivy nodded. Let it be. It's not ours. To reopen. He handed her a mug. Town council wants to turn the lakefront into a memorial garden. Ivy arched a brow. Seriously? He grinned. Small benches, native plants, maybe a plaque explaining the history, the real history. Her chest tightened, not with dread, but with something gentler, more unfamiliar. "Do it," she said softly. They drank in silence for a while, the lake flickering with the last light of day. "You ever think about leaving?" Dylan asked. Voice low, Ivy didn't hesitate. "No." He nodded like he already knew. Oak Ridge was no longer a place she was running from or hiding in. It was something else now, raw, weathered, quietly enduring. The kind of place that had finally learned how to speak, and she had become its memory. Not the kind inked in history books or carved into stone, but the kind that lived in the hearts of those who chose to face the darkness and stayed behind to see the dawn. That night, Ivy stepped outside before bed and walked barefoot to the water's edge. The lake was still, not silent, not hungry, just still. She knelt, pressed a hand to the earth and whispered, not a prayer, but a promise, "I will remember." And the lake, in its own way, whispered back, not with words, not with sound, but with stillness, with peace, with permission. It began again, not with a storm, not with screams, but with silence. A silence that was too complete. Ivy noticed it first one morning in late August, as she stood by the lake sipping her coffee. There were no birdsong, no wind, not even the usual rustle of leaves that whispered through the trees surrounding Oak Ridge. The world felt paused, as if holding its breath in anticipation of something long forgotten, or worse, something remembered. She set her mug down slowly, scanning the lake surface. The water had receded another few feet in the last month, revealing twisted roots and ridged shelves of stone, ancient carvings long faded by time and tide. At first glance, the lake looked tranquil, but Ivy had learned not to trust stillness. Not here, not anymore. There was no movement in the water, no insects dancing along the surface, no ripple, no wind, only the absence of sound. And in the absence of sound, Ivy felt something else. A pressure. It was faint, like standing next to a tuning fork struck minutes earlier. No audible note, only vibration. A low-frequency hum beneath her feet, subtle enough to dismiss, but insistent enough to lodge in her bones. She pressed her palm to the earth. It was pulsing, alive, and not in the way the lake had once been. This wasn't hunger. This was memory, reawakened. She returned to the library that afternoon. Felicity was there, sorting a shipment of returned books. The air inside was warm and musty, full of dust motes and sunlight cutting through slatted windows. Ivy hesitated in the doorway, unsure of what she was even looking for. Felicity looked up, her face instantly clouded. "It's the lake, isn't it?" Ivy nodded slowly. "Something's changed." Felicity crossed the room without a word and pulled a book from the far shelf. One of Malcolm's oldest ledgers, bound in brittle, blue cloth, its spine lined with fading gold leaf. She flipped it open to a page marked by a pressed oak leaf, long browned and curled. "Before the first sacrifice," Felicity said quietly, "there were quakes, gentle ones, barely felt, like tremors beneath the surface of things." Ivy's eyes scanned the page. The script was Malcolm's, uneven but meticulous. "We have heard it again, not in sound, but in weight, in the pressure beneath soil and stone. It is not calling, it is remembering. The bindings are holding, but memory seeps through like groundwater." "It's not reaching out," Ivy murmured. "It's leaking." Felicity met her gaze, voice hushed. "Whatever the settlers bound, it's still there. The curse was never just a hunger, it was a cage. And now the cage is rusting." By evening, the first animals began to flee. Birds took flight in thick, chaotic flocks. Woodpeckers, crows, sparrows, cutting through the sky like ash from a fire. Deer were seen sprinting across the road leading out of town, their movements erratic, as if something invisible had surged from the ground beneath them. Even the insects were gone. No chirping crickets, no buzzing gnats. Just a terrible, echoing quiet. Oak Ridge began to feel empty, a hollowed shell of itself. And yet the lake remained still. That night, Ivy sat alone on her porch. Dylan hadn't come by. He'd gone out to the far side of the lake to check on some of the old boundary markers. He hadn't returned by dark. The sky above was clear, starless. Not a cloud, not a moon. It was black and blank. She stood up and walked barefoot into her yard, the grass damp with dew that hadn't yet fallen. She stepped past the edge of the property, across the old stone path, and stopped where the earth began to feel softer, near where the seal had once been exposed. And then she heard it, not a voice, not a whisper, a breath. From under the soil, short, slow, measured, like something buried was dreaming of surfacing. She fell to her knees, hand pressed to the ground. Her breath caught in her throat. The lake was not calling for her this time. It wasn't calling for anyone. It was remembering itself. At dawn, Dylan returned. He looked shaken. "There's a crack in the eastern marker," he said, not even greeting her. "The old stone. It split down the middle. Something came up through it." "Animal?" Ivy asked, though she already knew the answer. "No." His voice trembled. "Something else. I don't think the bindings are just fading. I think..." He hesitated, eyes darkening. "I think something inside is trying to wake." Ivy looked back toward the lake, still calm, still beautiful, still false. "I think we mistook silence for surrender," she said. "But the lake doesn't surrender. It waits. And maybe," Dylan added, "we were never its enemy. Maybe it was protecting us from what lies beneath it." That night, Ivy dreamed of the spiral seal again. But this time it wasn't moss-covered or buried. It was glowing, and it was cracked. From the center of the spiral, black water poured, not in waves, but in slow, impossibly vertical streams, rising upward, like smoke drawn back into a chimney. And from beneath the cracks in the stone, a shape stirred. Something enormous, something faceless. Not hunger, not grief, not guilt, origin. She awoke with mud under her fingernails, and the sound of breathing under her floorboards. By morning, Ivy had emptied her pantry, pulled every loose book from her shelves, and pried open every floorboard in the back room of the cottage. Her breath fogged the air, though it wasn't cold, and her hands trembled with the certainty that something had shifted not in the lake, but beneath her home. The breathing hadn't stopped. It was slow, infrequent, not rhythmic like lungs, but measured like response, as if the very soil under her cabin exhaled when she spoke too loudly or stepped too suddenly. It didn't feel malevolent, but it didn't feel benign either. It felt ancient, listening, and it terrified her. Dylan arrived not long after sunrise, muddy and breathless, his jacket soaked through with dew and lake mist. "3 more boundary markers have split," he said without preamble. "One near the church hill, another along the ridge trail. And the third," his voice dropped, "third's in my backyard." Ivy turned slowly toward him, her stomach sinking. "You're sure?" He nodded. It wasn't just cracked, it was peeled open, like something reached from underneath and pushed upward. And there were lines in the dirt, not like roots, like fingers. The two of them stood in silence for a moment, the weight of it all pressing down like a closed room without windows. "Malcolm said the curse was a binding," Ivy whispered. "Not just a punishment. not just hunger. It was holding something. Dylan exhaled shakily. And now, it's getting out. They returned to the lake. The shoreline was exposed now more than ever before. The water had receded another 12 feet, bearing rocks and long rotted timber that had never seen sun in recorded memory. Ivy counted 2 dead trees tipped at strange angles near the spiral seal, their roots withered and blackened. The seal was cracked, not shattered, but split, from center outward, the spiral broken like an egg. The carved grooves wept dark water that smelled of rust and soil. What happens? Dylan asked softly. If the seal breaks entirely? Ivy didn't answer. Her eyes were on the soil just beyond the seal, where a strange growth had begun to emerge. Not a plant, not fungal, something calcified, almost architectural. It looked like ribs of bone, arching upward from the ground. In a slow curve, as if a spine were pushing from beneath the earth. Dylan stepped forward. "Ivy, don't," she snapped. Her heart hammered. "Don't touch it." They stared at it together. This thing, half grown or half resurfaced. It pulsed faintly like a heartbeat buried in stone. There was something wrong about its presence, something that felt like the opposite of the lake's hunger. It wasn't drawing things in. It was rising. That night, Ivy gathered the townspeople. Not all came. Some were too afraid. Others, older, brittle with denial, refused to believe there was still something beneath the lake, something that hadn't already been named and laid to rest. But enough of them came. Enough to matter. Ivy stood in the center of the old town square beneath the broken clock tower, her voice low and steady as she told them everything. What she and Dylan had found, what the cracks meant, what the lake's silence was truly hiding. "We're wrong to think the curse was the threat," she said. "The curse was the seal, the pact. It was keeping something asleep, something ancient, something that remembers the shape of the world before us." A hand rose from the crowd, an older woman, the schoolteacher, with thick glasses and shaking fingers. "What is it then?" she asked. "What does it want?" Ivy hesitated, the answer on her tongue before she realized she hadn't spoken it aloud. She didn't know how she knew, but she did. "It wants form," Ivy whispered. "It wants to become." That night, the breathing moved, from the floorboards to the walls, from the walls to the trees. Ivy could feel it in the very timber of the town. Somewhere deep below, something vast was unfolding itself, slowly, patiently, as if it had been hunched in darkness for centuries and was now stretching. She didn't sleep. Instead, she traced the spiral symbol into a fresh journal and began to draw what she had seen near the seal. The rising ribs of stone, the subtle curves of a structure not built but grown. A cathedral of bone, perhaps, or something older than cathedrals, something primordial. Dylan sat beside her, silent. After a long time, he asked, "Why now?" She stared at the page, the black ink still wet. "Because," she said slowly, "the lake was never the monster." He turned to her. The monster was underneath it. At dawn, the wind carried something strange into town, a sound Ivy had not heard in over a year. Weeping. It came from the shore. When she and Dylan reached the waterline, they found the spiral seal sunk slightly into itself, half buried in ash-colored sand. The plaque for Isabella had cracked clean through the center, her name no longer legible. But the weeping continued. It came from beneath the seal. It was not human, and it knew them by name. The weeping never ceased, not for a minute, not for a breath. It rose and fell like waves drawn through bone, a wet, ragged sound that scraped at the inside of Ivy's skull. Not crying from sorrow, not even pain. The sound beneath the lake was older than either It wept like a creature remembering its own form after being buried alive. It wept like awakening. By the second day, the townspeople began to feel it. A coldness in their teeth, a buzzing behind their eyes, dreams that didn't belong to them. Some dreamed of hands pressed against stone walls from the inside, others of long corridors beneath their homes, ceilings veined with roots and skin. Felicity dreamed of her mother's face, but when she reached to touch it, the skin melted away and something ancient opened its mouth behind the eyes. Oakridge, once a town suffocated by what it refused to remember, now couldn't stop remembering. The seal had cracked too wide, and the thing beneath it wasn't just stirring, it was sharing. On the third night, the rain began to fall, only it wasn't rain. It was warm, thick, and slightly red. Ivy stood barefoot in her yard as it pattered against her arms, staining her sleeves. She brought a trembling hand to her face and tasted it on her lips. Iron, earth, salt. Not blood, but something blood remembered. She turned toward the lake. In the dark, its surface looked stretched, as if a skin had been pulled tight across something vast beneath. The spiral was no longer visible. The shore had sunk 3 inches. It was rising, and the ground knew it. Inside the cottage, Dylan sat. At the table, books scattered before him, fingers dug into his scalp. "Everything's pointing back to the seal," he said, voice fraying. "All the journals, all the old rituals. That spiral. It wasn't just a symbol. It was a containment field, not just for memory, not just for the lake, for it." Ivy closed the door behind her, her breath catching. "And now it's breaking." He looked up, eyes bloodshot. "It isn't just breaking, it's transforming." He pushed a page toward her. Malcolm's handwriting, half-inked symbols curling like sinew. "The seal does not restrain with strength. It restrains with shape. If the spiral is broken, the shape beneath is no longer bound to one direction. It may spread. It's learning new geometry," Dylan whispered. "It's finding new routes to surface." Ivy stared at the symbols. They pulsed, not with light, but with recognition. She could feel her breath sinking with the curve of them, like her chest remembered the shape. "It's using us," she said, "to understand the world again. Through memory, through dreams, through our bodies." Dylan's hands were shaking. "And when it finishes remembering," Ivy looked toward the window, the rain still falling red, "it will take form." That night, the town bell rang for the first time in 40 years, but no one had rung it. It sounded once, low, and beneath it, the earth trembled, not with violence, but arrival. Ivy and Dylan ran to the ridge overlooking the lake. They weren't alone. Dozens had gathered, people in coats and pajamas and silence. No one spoke, because all of them saw it. The center of the lake had opened, not in an explosion, not in fire, in silence, as if the surface had simply peeled back to reveal a pit beneath, a massive yawning hollow that pulsed like a wound. And from that center, something began to unfold. At first, it looked like a tree or a root system, thick tendrils rising from the water, arching toward the sky, curling and expanding like veins learning gravity. They weren't alive in the traditional sense, but they weren't dead either. They were remembering how to live. Ivy's knees buckled. Dylan caught her. "What do we do?" he breathed. Ivy stared down at the lake. The seal was gone. The water had become a mouth, and Oakridge was standing at the edge of its tongue. She spoke without turning. "We finish what Malcolm started." Dylan frowned. "What do you mean?" She turned to him, eyes dark with certainty. "We don't run. We don't bury it. We descend." Back at her home, Ivy pulled open the cellar door. The breathing was stronger now, closer. She felt it rising through her spine as she stepped down the stairs, each wooden board groaning beneath her like a sigh. At the base of the cellar, behind the shelves of canning jars and forgotten tools, was the part she had avoided. The wall that had begun to crack after the seal broke, a vertical line no thicker than a vein. But it throbbed, pulsed with the breath of something massive behind it. She pressed her hand to it, and it opened. The wall didn't collapse. It peeled, and behind it a tunnel, wound with roots, lined with flesh, descending. The lake wasn't above anymore. It was under everything, and now it wanted her to see. Ivy didn't hesitate, not because she lacked fear, but because the fear had calcified, become a kind of armor. There was no safety left in Oak Ridge, no more time for wondering or waiting. The lake had unfolded, the seal had broken, and the tunnel beneath her home had opened like a throat. Whatever lived beneath had shaped the town for centuries, carved its rituals into the minds of settlers, whispered its hunger into their dreams. And now, it no longer whispered. It remembered her name. She stepped into the tunnel, her boots finding soft purchase on a floor that wasn't stone, wasn't soil. It gave slightly underfoot, pliable, veined and pulsing faintly like the underside of a tongue. Dylan followed, a flashlight in one hand, the other brushing against the tunnel wall for balance. Neither of them spoke. Silence was no longer absence here. Silence was presence. They walked for what felt like an hour, then longer. The tunnel wound downward in gentle spirals, impossibly vast, untouched by time. The further they descended, the warmer the air became. But it wasn't heat from fire, it was body heat, humid and close, like being inside the chest cavity of a sleeping beast. And then the tunnel widened. They stepped into a chamber that defied architecture, defied logic. A vast open space beneath the town, larger than any natural cavern should have been able to form. Ivy's light panned across the walls. None of it was rock. Everything was made of that same semi-organic material. Layers of skin, bone and dark, crystal woven together like veins through muscle. And in the center, the heart. It pulsed slowly, impossibly large, suspended from the ceiling and floor by thick cords of tendon-like roots. It beat, not with life, but with remembered life. Each contraction reverberated through the chamber like the toll of a bell. Deep underwater, Ivy stepped forward. The heart responded, and for the first time it spoke, not aloud, not in words. It projected, "You are not the first." The voice was in her chest, in her spine, vibrating her skull like a struck tuning fork. You are the first to descend with memory intact. She dropped to her knees. The force of it, too much. Why now? She whispered. Why rise now, after so many centuries? Because you named her, Isabella, the offering, the voice they had silenced. You pierced the forgetting. Ivy looked up. What are you? I am the origin of form, the vessel for history, the flood beneath foundation. I was buried to protect you. The spiral sealed me away, but the forgetting corrupted it. You called it a curse. It was a containment. Dylan knelt beside her, wide-eyed, the flashlight trembling in his grip. You thought I wanted blood. I wanted memory. I wanted truth. Ivy closed her eyes, the weight of generations pressing down on her shoulders. All this time, the blackening, the disappearances. You were trying to return. I am not your enemy. I am your witness. I hold what you refuse. The hunger was never mine. It was the town's. She sobbed quietly. The curse had never been a malevolent force. It had been a mirror, and Oak Ridge had fed it everything it feared to confront. She rose to her feet. Then what now? What do you want from me? A choice, she staggered. You have remembered the full shape. You have descended with open eyes. If you leave now, I will sleep again. I will wait for another to remember. But if you stay, if I stay, she asked, voice small, you will become the seal. Dylan turned to her, panic blooming in his face. No, Ivy. No. But she was already walking forward. I've carried the story, she said softly. But that's not enough. She placed her hand against the pulsing surface of the heart. It was warm, familiar. It has to be held. The chamber began to shake, but not in rage, in recognition. Tendons reached out gently, cradling her wrist, her waist, her spine. Dylan screamed her name as she was lifted, absorbed, her body dissolving into light, into language, into memory, and then stillness. Back in Oak Ridge, the weeping stopped. The lake began to fill again, slowly, gently, not with darkness, but with clarity. The seal did not return, because Ivy had taken its place. Her story, Isabella's story, had been accepted. Not to end the force beneath the town, but to join with it, to keep it safe, to make sure the forgetting never returned. The people of Oak Ridge did not build a monument. They did not name a holiday. Instead, they spoke her name at sunrise in the same breath as the weather, as a fact, as a constant. Ivy walked into the earth, and the earth remembered. And from that day forward, the lake never blackened again. It became what it had always longed to be, a witness, not a wound, not a hunger, just a still place to reflect what had once been buried.